Imagine Rome at dawn. Not the Rome of postcards, not the Rome of tidy guidebooks and orderly queues of tourists with cameras raised to the sky, but the city as it wakes beneath a pale, dusty light. The air smells of stone and old heat. Pigeons scatter from broken arches. The city hums beyond the ancient walls, modern engines mingling with the memory of wheels and sandals. And there, rising out of the center of it all like the skeleton of some impossible beast, stands the Colosseum. It is wounded now. Its outer ring is broken. Its marble is gone. The bronze clamps that once held its stones together were pried out centuries ago, leaving pitted scars in the travertine. Grass no longer grows where senators once sat, and the awnings that shaded 50,000 faces are long vanished. Yet even in ruin, it retains its power. It is not merely an ancient building. It is an argument in stone. A machine for spectacle. A monument to empire. A theater of death that promised glory, discipline, hierarchy, terror, and entertainment in the same breath. For centuries, people have looked at the Colosseum and seen what they most wanted to see. Romantics saw grandeur. Moralists saw cruelty. Nationalists saw permanence. Christians saw martyrdom. Tourists saw a symbol. Filmmakers saw myth. But the building itself offers a more difficult truth. It was not a mystery built for mystery's sake. It was designed with extraordinary clarity. Every corridor, every stair, every arch, every seat had a purpose. It was a place where Roman society could be arranged, displayed, and reinforced with breathtaking efficiency. And yet the myths persist. That every gladiator fought to the death. That Christians were slaughtered there by the thousands. That the arena could simply be flooded at will for mock naval battles, as if it were a giant swimming pool waiting beneath the floor. That the crowd's thumbs alone decided life or death. That the Colosseum existed only to satisfy bloodlust. The reality is more complicated, and because it is more complicated, it is more interesting. The real story of the Colosseum begins long before its first stone was laid. It begins with the Roman appetite for spectacle, with the politics of public generosity, with the evolution of amphitheaters in wood and stone, with the ambitions of generals and the anxieties of emperors. It begins with a fire that devastated Rome, with Nero's impossible palace, with civil war, and with a new dynasty desperate to legitimize itself in the eyes of a suspicious people. It continues through architecture so sophisticated that modern stadium designers still recognize its logic. Through a labor force drawn from every corner of empire. Through quarrymen, engineers, slaves, financiers, animal handlers, rope makers, carpenters, awning crews, scribes, guards, cooks, priests, and undertakers. Through gladiators who were not simply doomed victims but trained specialists in a violent profession. Through beasts imported from Africa and Asia. Through condemned criminals, ambitious emperors, and audiences hungry not just for blood but for meaning. Because that is what the Colosseum really offered Rome, meaning, staged and sharpened. In the arena, the empire dramatized itself. Here, civilization met savagery. Order met chaos. Discipline met fear. Rome met the world and proved, over and over again, that it could dominate both nature and man. Or at least that was the promise. Tonight, we are going to step inside that promise. We are going to walk back through the centuries, through smoke and marble dust, through political crisis and architectural triumph, through cheers, executions, applause, and silence. We will see how the Colosseum was born, what it meant, how it functioned, who paid for it, who died in it, who profited from it, and how it survived the empire that created it. And by the end, when we return to the ruins standing under the Roman sky, we may see it differently. Not as a dead monument, but as a witness. The Colosseum did not appear in a vacuum. Rome had to learn how to desire a building like that. It had to develop the habits, expectations, and rituals that made a giant amphitheater seem not only possible but necessary. To understand the Colosseum, we must first understand something deeply Roman: the public performance of power. Roman culture was never shy about display. Triumphs paraded conquered peoples and plundered wealth through the streets. Funeral processions recalled noble ancestry with masks and speeches. Public festivals tied politics to religion, generosity to ambition, memory to theater. In Rome, visibility mattered. To be seen giving was to be seen deserving. To sponsor games, feasts, or buildings was not private charity. It was a political act. In the early Republic, spectacles were often temporary affairs. Wooden structures could be erected for games and then dismantled. This suited a city still growing into empire, a city where aristocrats competed constantly for prestige but where permanent monumental entertainment architecture had not yet fully developed. Gladiatorial combat itself seems to have entered Roman life through funerary traditions, probably with roots in Campania and perhaps older Italic customs. At first these were not state-run mass entertainments in giant arenas, but more limited displays connected to elite funerals, acts of honor to the dead that slowly evolved into something else. As with so much in Roman history, what began as ritual became competition, and what became competition expanded. By the 3rd and 2nd centuries BCE, gladiatorial games were growing in frequency and scale. Wealthy magistrates and aristocrats discovered that such spectacles could serve political purposes far beyond the funeral context from which they had emerged. A memorable show could help build a public reputation. It could flatter the crowd, distract from tension, and display both wealth and traditional virtue. The sponsors of these games were not merely entertaining the people. They were investing in political capital. Yet the architecture lagged behind the appetite. Before the great stone amphitheaters, Romans often staged games in forums or temporary venues. Wooden stands rose and fell with the calendar of festivals. These structures could be dangerous, unstable, and inadequate to the crowds they drew. But they also reveal something important: the desire was already there. Long before the Colosseum existed, Roman society had developed a taste for watching organized violence in a setting where civic order framed the event. This habit intensified as Rome conquered the Mediterranean. Empire changed everything. Victories brought wealth, slaves, exotic animals, and an ever-expanding sense that Rome stood at the center of the world. Public spectacle expanded to reflect this reality. Generals who returned from war could mount ever more lavish displays. Conquered peoples might appear in chains. Wild animals from distant lands might be shown or killed. The world came to Rome, and Rome consumed it with its eyes. By the 1st century BCE, temporary arrangements no longer seemed enough. One of the key developments in this transformation was the amphitheater itself. The Romans inherited theater architecture from the Greeks and others, but the amphitheater was something distinct, not a semicircle for dramatic performance but an oval or elliptical space enclosing action on all sides. It was ideally suited to contests, hunts, and executions because it created a central arena visible from every seat. It transformed spectatorship. No longer was the audience arranged like an assembly facing a stage. Instead, it surrounded the action, encircling it with attention, judgment, and participation. This architectural form developed significantly in Italy, especially in Campania, where some of the earliest stone amphitheaters appeared. Pompeii's amphitheater, built around 70 BCE, survives as one of the oldest known stone examples. Though much smaller than the Colosseum, it already reveals mature Roman thinking. It was efficient, enclosed, purpose-built, and integrated into urban life. People entered through designated access points. They sat according to rank. They experienced violence in a designed environment. In other words, by the time the Colosseum was conceived, the Romans already understood exactly what an amphitheater was for. But the capital of the empire lagged strangely behind its provincial cities. Rome itself, enormous, politically charged, and crowded, often relied on temporary or repurposed spaces for major spectacles. That changed in part because of competition among powerful men during the late Republic. In 55 BCE, Pompey the Great dedicated Rome's first permanent stone theater, cleverly framing it as a temple complex to soften traditional suspicion of such structures. It was a spectacular act of self-advertisement. Julius Caesar, not to be outdone, pursued his own monumental projects. The city was becoming a stage for rival ambition, its architecture woven into political identity. The same logic applied to spectacle buildings more broadly. Permanent entertainment venues could shape public memory. They were not just practical solutions but ideological statements. By the time the Republic collapsed into civil wars and the Augustan Age emerged, Rome had become the capital of an empire whose people expected splendor. Augustus and his successors invested heavily in monumental urbanism, restoring temples, building forums, and presenting themselves as benefactors of the Roman people. Yet the great permanent amphitheater in the center of Rome still did not exist. Why? Partly because spectacle in Rome was still tied to improvisation, politics, and inherited habits. Partly because central urban space was precious. Partly because emperors had many ways to display generosity. And partly because the event that would make the Colosseum possible had not yet happened. That event was disaster. In 64 CE, a catastrophic fire tore through Rome. Whole districts burned. Thousands were displaced. The city was traumatized. And out of that trauma rose one of the most infamous imperial building projects in history, Nero's Domus Aurea, the Golden House. Its significance for the story of the Colosseum cannot be overstated. Because the ground on which the Colosseum would stand had first to be claimed, and then reclaimed. It would be born, quite literally, from the politics of stolen space. When the Great Fire of Rome broke out in July of 64 CE, the city became an inferno. Ancient Rome was vulnerable to such disaster. Its streets were crowded and narrow. Many buildings were made partly or largely of wood. Open flames were everywhere, whether in workshops, kitchens, shrines, or lamps. Once a serious fire began, it could leap from district to district with terrifying speed. And this one did. For days it raged, then revived, then spread again. Entire neighborhoods vanished into smoke and ruin. Ancient authors, especially Tacitus, give us a city in panic, people fleeing with whatever they could carry, others trapped by collapsing buildings, rumors multiplying as quickly as flames. The scale of destruction was immense. Of Rome's 14 administrative regions, some were almost completely destroyed and most of the rest damaged. And at the center of the memory of that fire stands Nero. The emperor's reputation in later tradition became inseparable from this catastrophe. The story that he sang while Rome burned, performing of the fall of Troy as the city collapsed around him, is likely more legend than fact, shaped by hostile sources who loathed him. But whether or not he literally performed during the fire, his response to the aftermath became politically disastrous. He did organize relief and reconstruction measures. He did seek to reshape the burned city according to more orderly principles. But he also did something that seemed unforgivable to many Romans. He appropriated a vast section of central Rome for his own pleasure palace. The Domus Aurea, or Golden House, was not a single house in the ordinary sense. It was a sprawling imperial landscape of astonishing luxury, stretching across parts of the Palatine, Oppian, and Celian hills and incorporating gardens, pavilions, porticos, artificial groves, and a huge ornamental lake. Ancient writers were scandalized by it. Suetonius describes dining rooms with ivory ceilings and rotating structures meant to shower guests with perfumes and flowers. The walls glittered. The spaces were expansive, theatrical, and self-consciously extraordinary. The most shocking feature was not simply luxury, though there was plenty of that. It was the use of central urban land. In a city where ordinary people lived cramped and insully, where public space and circulation mattered deeply, Nero seemed to have taken the heart of Rome and turned it into a private fantasy. This mattered politically because Roman emperors were never supposed to appear merely as kings in the Eastern or Hellenistic sense, isolated in magnificent palaces above the people. Roman political culture, even under autocracy, maintained republican language and civic expectations. The emperor was supposed to be first among citizens, the guardian of public good, the benefactor of the people. To seize urban space and convert it into an imperial pleasure park was to violate that expectation in a way both visible and symbolic. Nero's colossal statue of himself, probably represented as the sun god, intensified the effect. Here was not just an emperor ruling Rome, but an emperor monumentalizing himself within it. The memory of the Domus Aurea became inseparable from Nero's broader image as a ruler of excess, performance, and alienation from Roman norms. Modern historians rightly stress that our surviving sources are hostile and often exaggerated. Nero was not simply a cartoon tyrant. But the political symbolism of the Golden House was real enough. It made visible a dangerous idea, that the city belonged to the emperor personally. Then in 68 CE, Nero's regime collapsed. His death triggered a year of chaos known as the Year of the Four Emperors. Galba came and fell. Otho came and fell. Vitellius came and fell. Armies marched, emperors rose and died, and the Roman world learned just how fragile imperial legitimacy could be when succession was uncertain and military loyalty divided. Out of this crisis emerged Vespasian. He was not young, glamorous, or aristocratically dazzling. He was a practical soldier and administrator from a family of relatively modest standing by Roman elite standards. His path to power came through military success and civil war, not inherited inevitability. That meant he faced a fundamental problem shared by many new rulers: how to convince the empire, and above all the city of Rome, that his power was rightful, stable, and beneficial. The Flavian dynasty, which Vespasian founded, needed legitimacy. And one of the most brilliant acts of political theater in Roman history was the decision to build a massive public amphitheater on the very site of Nero's private lake. The symbolism was perfect. Where Nero had enclosed central Rome within imperial luxury, Vespasian would return that space to the people. Where Nero had staged his own magnificence, Vespasian would stage public entertainment. Where civil war had revealed imperial instability, the Flavians would build permanence. The act was architectural revenge against Nero and architectural self-justification for the new dynasty. This is why the Colosseum must never be understood merely as a sports venue or an entertainment facility. From the beginning, it was a political statement in stone. The lake of the Domus Aurea had to be drained. The terrain had to be stabilized. Foundations had to be prepared in a space once occupied by one of the most hated symbols of imperial selfishness. And when construction began around 70 or 72 CE, financed in part by the spoils from the Jewish war, the message was unmistakable: the new emperor would not hoard the city. He would give it back in monumental form. A public arena where a private lake had been. A civic gift where an imperial fantasy had stood. And this gift would be colossal. That is the next secret of the Colosseum. It was born not just from engineering ambition, but from one of the sharpest political calculations of the Roman age. Vespasian inherited a traumatized empire. Civil war had not only torn through the provinces and the armies, it had also shattered the illusion that imperial power passed naturally and securely. Rome had watched emperors rise and vanish in rapid succession, not through law or orderly process, but through military momentum and collapse. The question before Vespasian was not merely how to rule, but how to make rule itself seem stable again. He understood something essential. A dynasty could not rest on victory alone. It had to become visible. It had to be felt in taxes collected, grain delivered, roads maintained, enemies subdued, and above all in public works that translated power into tangible benefit. An emperor who restored order had to be seen restoring it. And so Vespasian's reign was marked by a deliberate effort to project sobriety, practicality, and civic generosity in contrast to Nero's theatrical excess. This was propaganda, certainly. But Roman propaganda was rarely just about slogans. It worked through ritual, architecture, coins, ceremonies, and everyday urban experience. Power was persuasive when it seemed embedded in the world itself. The future Colosseum, known to the Romans as the Flavian Amphitheater, was one of the boldest examples of this principle. By choosing the site of Nero's lake, Vespasian was not merely selecting a large available parcel of land. He was making an argument. The emperor who had taken central Rome for himself would be answered by a dynasty that created a monumental public venue. The city would be reordered not around imperial indulgence but around communal spectacle. Of course, that interpretation should not blind us to another reality. This public gift was also an exercise in control. The Roman people were not being empowered in any democratic sense. They were being managed, impressed, and integrated into a new political settlement. The amphitheater did not challenge imperial authority. It dramatized imperial beneficence. It let the emperor appear generous precisely because he had the power to give on so vast a scale. Vespasian's political intelligence lay in understanding that these things were not contradictory. He could strengthen his position by appearing to serve the people. He could claim moral contrast with Nero while exercising equally vast power. He could bind the city to the Flavian house through a building that all Rome would know, all Rome would use, and no one could ignore. The financing itself carried ideological weight. Ancient sources suggest that the spoils from the suppression of the Jewish revolt contributed significantly to the project. The Arch of Titus later commemorated that victory. Captives from the war, including enslaved labor, may well have been drawn into the immense work of construction. If so, the Colosseum embodied empire at every level. Foreign conquest became Roman entertainment. Defeated enemies became the labor and wealth from which public magnificence arose. That was the logic of empire made architectural. And yet Vespasian's gamble was enormous. The scale of the project was unprecedented in Rome. This would not be a modest amphitheater or a provincial imitation. It would be the greatest structure of its kind the world had ever seen. Why take such a risk? Because scale itself mattered. An emperor still consolidating legitimacy could not afford gestures that seemed tentative. The Flavians needed a monument that matched the magnitude of their claim. They were not a stopgap regime. They were the future. The amphitheater would say so more eloquently than any decree. The building also fit into a broader Flavian program of construction and restoration. Vespasian rebuilt the Temple of Peace. He restored the capital after fire. He invested in infrastructure and symbolic renewal. Rome had been scarred by both literal and political flames, and the Flavians presented themselves as healers of the city. The amphitheater became one centerpiece in that wider effort. But there was a practical challenge that no rhetoric could overcome: the thing had to be built. And built quickly enough to serve the dynasty that conceived it. Vespasian likely did not expect to see the entire project completed in all its later refinements. Construction of a monument this large would take years. But he began it, and that mattered. The foundations of a dynasty, like the foundations of a building, begin underground and out of sight. They must exist before the visible structure rises. The engineering challenge alone was formidable. The site, once occupied by Nero's lake, presented hydrological and structural complications. The marshy basin had to be stabilized. Massive foundations needed to bear the weight of an elliptical building of stone, concrete, and brick-faced masonry on a scale Rome had never attempted for an amphitheater. This was not just architecture. It was a statement that Roman engineering could reclaim even unstable land and turn it into order. The Flavian amphitheater's plan reflected ruthless efficiency. Its elliptical form maximized visibility. Its radial and annular corridors enabled large crowds to move in and out rapidly. Its tiered seating organized society physically. Its arches supported weight while allowing circulation. Even before the decoration and marble finishes were in place, the logic of the structure communicated control. Vespasian himself would die in 79 CE before the amphitheater's inaugural games. Its opening fell to his son Titus. Its final major refinements came under his younger son Domitian. In that sense, the Colosseum was a dynastic project in the deepest way. Father began it, elder son dedicated it, younger son modified and perfected it. The building linked the Flavian household to the city's memory across a generation. This is one reason it later became such a powerful symbol. It was never just the product of one ruler's whim. It was a sustained dynastic effort to shape how Rome understood itself after crisis. There is something almost paradoxical in the result. The Colosseum was an arena of slaughter, but it was also a promise of order. A place where men and animals died before cheering crowds, but also a monument through which the state announced its strength, generosity, and permanence. Vespasian understood that in Rome, these things belonged together. A ruler who could command labor from across the empire, extract wealth from conquest, transform the center of the city, and then fill that city with spectacle was not weak. He was not temporary. He was not another claimant in a passing civil war. He was emperor. And if the people cheered inside that great arena, they were cheering not only the games. They were cheering the restoration of a world. At least for now. To stand inside the Colosseum today is to see only part of its genius. The ruin is magnificent, but ruin can mislead. Broken arches and exposed masonry suggest age, romantic decay, and survival against time. What they do not immediately show is how astonishingly modern the building once was in its logic. The Colosseum was not simply large. It was organized. It solved problems of mass movement, structural support, visibility, crowd control, and stagecraft at a scale few ancient buildings attempted. It was a machine. The site itself presented difficulties from the beginning. Nero's artificial lake had occupied the basin. That meant the ground had to be drained and stabilized before any monumental construction could proceed. Roman engineers, masters of practical adaptation, laid deep foundations of concrete. Their use of opus caementitium, Roman concrete, was one of the great enabling technologies of imperial architecture. Combined with stone facing, brick, and carefully calculated load distribution, it allowed structures that would have been difficult or impossible with traditional cut stone methods alone. The overall form of the amphitheater was elliptical, roughly 189 meters long and 156 meters wide. The arena floor itself measured about 87 by 55 meters. These numbers are easy to cite and easy to forget. Better to imagine the effect. This was a building that could dominate the urban landscape, absorb tens of thousands of bodies, and still function with remarkable precision. Depending on how one calculates ancient seating density, the capacity may have ranged from around 50,000 to perhaps more. What matters is that it held a crowd of a size unimaginable in most ancient settings. The exterior rose in 4 principal levels. The lower 3 featured arcades framed by engaged columns in progressively lighter classical orders, Tuscan below, Ionic in the middle, Corinthian above. The 4th story was more solid, punctuated by windows and pilasters, and likely included the support system for the great awning, the velarium. This arrangement was not merely decorative. It imposed visual order, hierarchy, and rhythm on a building of immense mass. Rome loved engineering, but it also loved the appearance of engineering made beautiful. Travertine limestone formed much of the external skeleton, quarried at Tivoli and transported to Rome. Iron clamps held major blocks together. Tufa and brick-faced concrete played major roles in the internal structure. Marble finished seating areas and decorative surfaces. Wood supplied floors, mechanisms, stair details, and the arena itself. What makes the Colosseum extraordinary is not any one material, but the integration of them all. The building circulation system was among its greatest triumphs. Modern stadium designers would recognize the underlying principle immediately. Crowds had to enter, find their assigned places, and leave efficiently without catastrophic bottlenecks. The Colosseum solved this through a sophisticated network of numbered entrances, radial passageways, concentric corridors, and staircases. Spectators could be sorted according to social status and directed toward the appropriate sections with remarkable speed. This is where one of the building's deepest truths emerges: architecture and society were inseparable. The corridors did not merely move people. They classified them. Elite access points led to prestigious seats. Ordinary entrances funneled the masses upward and outward. The emperor and vestal virgins had privileged placement. Senators sat near the action. Women and the poor were pushed high above. In stone, Rome taught Romans where they belonged. The term vomitoria, often popularized for comic effect in modern retellings, referred to passageways that disgorged crowds into seating areas. The Colosseum had many such access points. Their design made it possible to clear or fill much of the amphitheater rapidly. This mattered practically, for safety, for ceremony, for crowd management, but it also contributed to the experience. The audience did not drift in casually. It was processed, ordered, inserted into a vast civic mechanism. The arena itself, in its earliest phase, may initially have been simpler beneath the floor than the later hypogeum would become. During Titus's inaugural games, some scholars argue, the underground substructure was not yet in its fully developed permanent form, which may have allowed certain dramatic effects, possibly including limited flooding. Later, under Domitian, the area beneath the arena was transformed into a complex permanent network of corridors, holding pens, lifts, and stage machinery. But even before those modifications, the arena floor was designed as a carefully managed performance surface layered above logistical systems. Consider the manpower involved. Quarrymen extracted travertine blocks and shaped them. Teams hauled materials overland. Surveyors measured the ellipse with precision. Engineers calculated thrust and load. Concrete workers mixed, poured, and set foundations. Stonecutters shaped arches and seating. Brickmakers supplied the endless needs of vaulting and walls. Carpenters built scaffolding, cranes, and temporary supports. Metalworkers forged clamps and fittings. Supervisors coordinated the entire operation. This was imperial construction at full capacity, drawing on the administrative and extractive power of a vast empire. Ancient cranes using treadwheels and pulley systems made it possible to lift heavy materials to impressive heights. Roman building sites were places of noise, discipline, and danger. Dust filled the air. Orders were shouted. Ropes strained. Animals hauled loads. Accidents must have been common, though our sources rarely linger on the human cost of monumental building except when trying to make moral points. Great buildings tend to conceal the exhausted bodies that made them. And then there was time. The amphitheater rose astonishingly fast given its scale. Begun under Vespasian and opened under Titus in 80 CE, it stands as a reminder of what concentrated imperial resources could achieve. Final refinements under Domitian continued the process, but the essential monument was in place within about a decade. That speed itself was political. The Flavians did not merely promise renewal. They delivered it visibly and soon enough for memory to connect donor and gift. Perhaps the most remarkable feature of the building is the way it balanced permanence and adaptability. Its stone shell was monumental and durable. Yet within that shell, many features were dynamic. Awnings could be rigged overhead. Wooden arena surfaces could be altered. Scenery could be installed. Machinery could raise animals and performers dramatically into view. Guards and attendants could regulate access. The Colosseum was not static architecture. It was programmable space. The exterior too carried meaning. The arcades opened the structure visually to the city. Statues likely filled many of the arches on the second and third levels, adding visual splendor. The great bulk of the amphitheater sat amid other imperial buildings, linked to roads, public spaces, and sight lines. It did not hide itself. It announced itself. Its later name, the Colosseum, probably derived not from its own size directly but from Nero's colossal statue nearby, which remained in modified form under later rulers. The amphitheater's original name, the Flavian Amphitheater, foregrounded the dynasty. The later nickname foregrounded the surrounding landscape of memory. Both are revealing. One names power. The other names scale. When spectators approached the building in the 1st century, they encountered not a ruin but something radiant with newness. Marble gleamed. Paint accented details. Bronze fittings flashed in the light. Statues populated niches. The crowd moved toward a structure that did not look ancient, tragic, or mysterious. It looked like triumph. It looked like control over matter itself. And when those thousands entered the vaults and passageways, climbing through the belly of that immense stone body toward their designated seats, they were not merely going to a show. They were entering the empire's most perfectly designed theater of itself. Monuments have a way of simplifying memory. When people speak of the Colosseum, they say Vespasian built it, Titus opened it, Domitian modified it. These statements are true in one sense. Emperors commissioned, financed, and politically owned the project. But emperors did not quarry the stone, mix the concrete, set the arches, shape the timber, haul the marble, train the animals, forge the iron, or die in construction accidents. The Colosseum was built by an empire, and like all imperial monuments, it concealed the complexity of human labor beneath the simplicity of an imperial name. Let us try to bring that hidden workforce into view. The Roman Empire was exceptionally good at mobilizing resources across distance. It could tax provinces, requisition materials, move troops, and channel wealth toward urban projects on an extraordinary scale. The Colosseum was one result of that system. Its construction depended on quarry networks, transport routes, administrative coordination, and the coercive capacities of Roman power. Travertine came largely from quarries at Tibur, modern Tivoli, east of Rome. Quarrying stone on that scale was brutal work. Blocks had to be identified, cut, separated, dressed, and moved with remarkable precision. Quarry labor likely involved a mix of free workers, enslaved people, and perhaps convict labor depending on context. We should resist imagining a single labor model. Roman production systems were flexible, varied, and often opportunistic. But coercion was everywhere in the ancient economy, and monumental architecture drank deeply from it. Then there was the matter of manpower from war. Ancient sources link the amphitheater's funding to the spoils from the Jewish war, especially after the fall of Jerusalem in 70 CE. Josephus and later evidence strongly suggest that triumphal wealth from Judea flowed into Flavian public projects. The temple treasures paraded in Titus's triumph became famous, but money mattered as much as symbolism. Campaigns produced plunder, tribute, and captives. Some of those captives almost certainly entered systems of labor that fed Roman building projects. Later tradition often claimed that Jewish prisoners themselves built the Colosseum. This should be handled carefully. The simple claim that the entire structure was erected by enslaved Jewish captives is too blunt and likely too neat. But it is entirely plausible that large numbers of war captives from the Judean conflict were absorbed into labor forces connected to Flavian construction. What matters most is not the exact ethnic composition of every crew, which we cannot fully recover, but the larger truth: conquest was transformed into architecture. The empire turned military victory into urban stone. Every empire does this in some way, but Rome was particularly literal about it. At the construction site itself, labor would have been specialized and hierarchical. Roman building did not depend merely on brute force. It depended on expertise. Architects and engineers planned. Surveyors marked dimensions. Foremen organized teams. Master masons shaped structural components. Brick and concrete specialists executed vaulting systems. Carpenters erected scaffolding and cranes. Metalworkers supplied clamps, fittings, hinges, and tools. Teamsters and animal handlers managed transport. Water and food had to be supplied. Accounts had to be kept. Schedules coordinated. The romantic image of ancient construction as masses of anonymous workers dragging stone in chaotic misery misses the sophistication of Roman logistics. The labor was hard, dangerous, and often coerced, but it was also technically organized. This was not simply force. It was system. And that system extended far beyond the city of Rome. To build the Colosseum required not just local labor but imperial extraction. Forests had to provide timber. Kilns had to bake bricks and tiles. Lime had to be produced for mortar. Sand and pozzolanic ash had to be acquired for concrete. Marble, whether from Italy or elsewhere, had to be quarried and shipped. The awning system later required vast amounts of rope, canvas, masts, and marine expertise. Even the decorative and functional iron was part of wider mining and metallurgical networks. The Colosseum was a local object made possible by global reach. There is also the question of slavery more broadly. Roman society depended heavily on enslaved labor in households, agriculture, mines, workshops, and public enterprises. Large building projects drew on this reservoir. Some enslaved workers were highly skilled and could occupy positions of real responsibility despite their status. Others performed the hardest and most dangerous tasks. Some may have been hired out by owners to contractors or the state. Others worked directly under imperial administration. It is impossible to separate the Colosseum from this world of unfreedom. The amphitheater that would later stage slavery, punishment, and violent domination was itself born from structures of domination. This raises a morally uncomfortable but historically necessary point. The Colosseum was not a contradiction within Roman civilization. It was an expression of it. The same society that perfected legal administration, road networks, and monumental engineering also normalized conquest, slavery, and public death. The amphitheater joined these realities rather than standing apart from them. Once the main structure rose, secondary labor systems came into play. Stone surfaces had to be finished. Seating was installed and inscribed. Balustrades and protective barriers were fitted. Statues were placed. Drainage and maintenance systems were completed. The arena surface itself, a wooden platform covered with sand, demanded constant replacement and repair. Beneath and around the structure, storage rooms, holding spaces, service corridors, and eventually the hypogeum needed ongoing labor. A building like this was never truly finished. It entered a new phase, operation. That phase required another hidden army. Sweepers cleaned the seating. Guards controlled entrances and protected elite spectators. Water carriers and vendors served the crowd. Scribes may have managed seating records and event notices. Arena attendants raked sand, removed corpses, reset scenery, and handled equipment. Animal keepers housed, fed, and controlled imported beasts. Medical personnel or at least practical surgeons attended to gladiators. Carpenters maintained lifts and mechanisms. Sailors or trained riggers handled the velarium overhead. Administrative officials managed expenditures, scheduling, and public order. A giant amphitheater was not just built once and then simply inhabited. It had to be continuously maintained through labor. And who paid for that labor? Ultimately the imperial state, though state in Rome cannot be neatly separated from emperor, treasury, taxation, and local obligations. Revenues from provinces, tribute, confiscations, and imperial estates all formed part of the financial ecology. Spectacle itself was not profitable in the modern ticketed sense. Access was generally free or distributed through patronage and administrative systems. The point was not revenue extraction from audiences. The point was political return. Games purchased loyalty, gratitude, and visibility. The emperor paid, and by paying, claimed the right to public acclaim. This meant that the people of the empire funded the theater in which the empire displayed itself. Farmers in far provinces, merchants in taxed cities, miners in dangerous pits, enslaved captives from conquered wars, all helped sustain the institution, whether they ever saw Rome or not. There is a temptation when looking at ancient monuments to separate beauty from cost. To admire the arches while forgetting the exhaustion. To praise engineering while ignoring the hands worn raw by rope and stone. But the Colosseum resists such simplification if we look closely enough. It is magnificent, yes. It is also an archive of labor relations, class hierarchy, and imperial violence. Its builders did not all choose the task. Some were ambitious professionals. Some were ordinary laborers earning what they could. Some were captives with no choice at all. And in the finished structure, their names mostly disappeared. That too is part of the secret of the Colosseum. It made anonymity useful. The emperor's name survived. The workers became masonry. If the exterior of the Colosseum proclaimed Roman power to the city, the interior taught Romans how that power was supposed to be lived. No one entered the building as a generic spectator. They entered as who they were, or rather as who the Roman state said they were. Senator. Knight. Citizen. Foreigner. Woman. Slave. Priestess. Magistrate. Commoner. Each body had a place. Each place had a meaning. And the architecture enforced that meaning with astonishing confidence. This is one of the deepest truths about the Colosseum: it did not merely host Roman society. It arranged it. Let us imagine a day of games during the High Empire. Rome is already awake. Crowds move through the surrounding streets. Hawkers shout. Patrons and clients cluster together. Officials hurry. The emperor's presence, if expected, electrifies the mood. As people approach the amphitheater, they do not all converge into a single democratic stream. They peel away toward designated entrances according to status and authorization. The building had around 80 entrances, though not all were for ordinary circulation. Major axial entrances at the short ends served ceremonial and functional purposes. One was associated with the entrance of performers and participants. Another probably facilitated the removal of the dead. Other numbered arches handled the public, separating flow and directing different groups through the structure efficiently. This numbering system mattered. It made a building of bewildering scale navigable. A spectator could be assigned not merely a general section but a specific access route. Again, the comparison to modern stadiums is unavoidable. The Romans had solved the problem of mass audience management so effectively that the principles feel familiar even now. But familiarity should not soften the ideological force of the design. The best seats were closest to the arena. There sat the senators, men whose status rested on lineage, property, office, and nearness to power. Their names could be inscribed on seats. Their position was not just comfortable, it was prestigious and visible. To sit there was to be seen sitting there. In Rome, honor was public or it was nothing. The emperor's box occupied the prime symbolic position, often on the long axis. Opposite or nearby sat the Vestal Virgins, the sacred priestesses whose visibility signaled Rome's religious continuity. High officials, magistrates, and priests had their appropriate places. The equestrian order, wealthy but beneath the senatorial class, occupied the next tier. Ordinary male citizens filled the sections beyond. At the top, in the least desirable seats, were women, except for the Vestals, and the poorest spectators. This arrangement reflects a social world of brutal clarity. Rome was not embarrassed by hierarchy. It celebrated it. The amphitheater allowed that hierarchy to become visible in a single glance. If you could have floated above the arena and looked down, the city would have appeared sorted by dignity in concentric bands. That visibility was itself pleasurable to Roman elites. The crowd did not gather as an anonymous mass. It gathered as a perfectly graded social body under imperial supervision. Augustus had earlier legislated seating distinctions in public venues, and later arrangements in the Colosseum reflect that broader concern with moral and social order. Spectacle threatened disorder because it drew great crowds, inflamed emotion, and mixed populations. Architecture answered that threat by compartmentalizing attention. Everyone watched the same show, but not from the same world. There were practical reasons for some of this, of course. Elites had to be protected from surging crowds. Officials needed rapid access and secure movement. Crowd management demanded structure. Yet the system did more than solve logistics. It made logistics ideological. Think of the emotional education embedded in the building. A poor spectator climbing to the upper tiers physically experienced distance from privilege. A senator, stepping directly into a marble seat close to the sand, physically experienced entitlement. A woman in the upper reaches learned the limits placed on female public visibility. A magistrate saw his rank mirrored in architecture. The crowd became an audience not only for the arena but for itself. The materials reinforced the distinctions. Lower seating zones enjoyed better finishes, easier access, and superior views. Marble seating, inscriptions, barriers, and decorative detail all signaled esteem. Higher up, conditions were more cramped, less comfortable, more exposed to weather despite the awning. The closer one sat to power, the more architecture seemed to honor the body. And yet this stratified audience shared a common visual field. That too mattered. The poor could see the rich. The rich could hear the poor. The emperor could be seen by all. The amphitheater managed hierarchy without severing collective experience. This was part of its brilliance. Rome could dramatize unity without dissolving rank. In this sense, the Colosseum was a political technology. It assembled the urban population in a way few institutions could. It offered free entertainment. It displayed imperial generosity. It projected social stability. And it absorbed tension by giving people a place to feel intensely together while remaining visibly separate. Even movement inside the building was psychologically charged. Corridors narrowed and widened. Light shifted. A spectator emerging from the vaults into the seating bowl would suddenly confront the open brilliance of the arena below. The experience was theatrical even before the games began. One moved from the compressed complexity of passageways into a grand, luminous space centered on sand, blood, and imperial presence. Safety and crowd control were never absent from Roman thinking. Large gatherings could be dangerous. Earlier disasters in temporary venues had proven that. The Colosseum circulation system, stairways, and segmentation helped mitigate panic and facilitate control. Guards and officials would have monitored movement closely, especially when the emperor was present. Disorder in such a venue was not just inconvenient. It was politically dangerous. The arena barrier itself formed another line of separation. Elite seats close to the action required protection from charging animals or stray violence. Nets, barriers, and perhaps revolving rollers or additional defenses helped secure the front rows. Even the most privileged spectators wanted proximity to danger, not actual danger. That distinction tells us much about Roman spectacle. The audience desired risk as performance, not risk as reality. This is why the Colosseum cannot be understood merely through the events staged in its center. The building's social choreography was part of the spectacle. Seeing senators in white-bordered togas, the emperor elevated in his place, the Vestals distinguished from other women, the masses rising tier on tier toward the sky, this was part of what one came to witness. Roman order was not presumed. It was enacted. And beneath it all was the knowledge that access itself depended on power. Invitations, allocations, patronage networks, official distributions, these shaped who attended and where they sat. Free did not mean equal. Free meant bestowed. In the amphitheater, the Roman people were given a gift. But they received it exactly where Rome wanted them to sit. Modern people often ask a question that sounds simple and is anything but. How could they enjoy it? How could a crowd watch men wounded, animals butchered, criminals executed, and react with excitement, approval, even delight? The question is understandable, but it can also become a way of distancing ourselves too easily. We tell ourselves that the Romans were uniquely brutal, uniquely desensitized, uniquely alien. Then we stop thinking. But the real answer is not that they were monsters. It is that spectacle in Rome carried meanings that made violence legible, satisfying, and socially valuable. To understand the Colosseum, we must understand the crowd. Roman audiences did not enter the amphitheater expecting random chaos. They expected program, pattern, and significance. A day at the games was not one continuous bloodbath without distinction. Events were often structured by type and time. Animal hunts, or venations, might occupy the morning. Executions often came at midday. Gladiatorial combats tended to occur in the afternoon. This rhythm mattered. It created anticipation and variety. The amphitheater offered not one emotional note, but a sequence: wonder, suspense, disgust, amusement, excitement, pity, triumph. The crowd's appetite was therefore not just for killing. It was for spectacle as narrative. Roman culture was deeply invested in public exempla, moral examples staged or recounted for communal instruction. In law courts, funerals, history writing, triumphs, and public ritual, Romans displayed people and actions as lessons. The arena fit into that world. Courage under pressure, endurance in pain, contempt for death, punishment of crime, domination of nature, submission of foreignness, all could be dramatized before the people. This does not make the spectacles humane. It makes them intelligible. A criminal execution in the amphitheater was not merely disposal of a condemned body. It was punishment made public, a visible reaffirmation that order existed and violation had consequences. A gladiator's display of skill and composure could be admired because Romans valued self-control under threat. A beast hunt impressed because it showed human mastery over the dangerous and exotic. Even the staging of mythological scenes through execution or combat tied violence to literary imagination. The crowd was not passive in all this. It was responsive, vocal, interpretive. People shouted. They cheered favored gladiators. They mocked incompetence. They reacted to courage and cowardice. They petitioned emperors. They formed factions and personal loyalties. Graffiti and inscriptions from across the Roman world reveal named favorites, fan enthusiasm, and sexual admiration for gladiators. The arena generated celebrity. This is crucial. Gladiators were not faceless victims. The successful ones became known, discussed, desired, and remembered. That does not mean they were free or safe. It means the relationship between audience and performer was more layered than simple bloodlust. Roman moralists sometimes worried about the crowd's passions. Seneca, for example, famously expressed disgust at the coarsening effects of certain spectacles, especially the midday executions. He saw the arena as capable of corrupting viewers by habituating them to cruelty and inflaming their worst impulses. Such criticism reminds us that Roman opinion was not monolithic. There were contemporaries who recoiled. But even their criticism confirms how central the games were. One did not denounce what did not matter. Why did emperors care so much about crowd response? Because the amphitheater was one of the few places where ruler and ruled encountered one another directly at scale. The emperor could not ignore the emotional economy of the crowd. Applause mattered. Murmurs mattered. Collective disappointment could sting. Public generosity that failed to satisfy was politically dangerous. Emperors understood that games were a form of communication. By sponsoring them, attending them, and responding within them, a ruler demonstrated attentiveness to the people. This is part of the old phrase, bread and circuses, coined by Juvenal with sardonic force. The line is often used today to imply shallow distraction: give people food and entertainment, and they will ignore the loss of freedom. There is truth in that, but it oversimplifies. Games were not apolitical narcotics. They were political events. The people gathered, saw, judged, petitioned, and interpreted. Spectacle could pacify, yes, but it could also become a venue for pressure and expectation. Crowd psychology in the Colosseum was amplified by scale and architecture. Tens of thousands reacting together created intensity beyond individual preference. Excitement spread quickly. So did fear or disgust. To sit in that giant bowl, surrounded by noise, heat, color, ritual, and danger, was to feel oneself part of something larger than personal opinion. Collective emotion took on authority. If everyone around you cheered a display of bravery, you were drawn into that admiration. If the crowd hissed a coward, the moral judgment seemed self-evident. This helps explain why spectacle could educate as well as entertain. The crowd taught itself what to value. And yet we should not imagine uniformity. Different social groups surely experienced events differently. Elite authors often sneered at popular tastes. Some spectators likely came for the pageantry more than the slaughter, others for the opposite. Some admired technique, others sensation. Some were thrilled by exotic animals. Some watched emperors as much as gladiators. Women in the stands, though constrained by seating hierarchies, were not absent from the emotional life of the games. Nor were foreigners, provincials, slaves, and lower-status citizens who absorbed the event through their own lenses. The amphitheater was one of the few spaces in Rome where these groups, however segregated, were still present within a common field of reaction. And then there is the uncomfortable mirror. Modern audiences are often scandalized by Roman blood sports, but they too consume violence, through cinema, sport, news, digital media, crime narratives, disaster footage, and political spectacle. The forms differ. The moral frameworks differ. The legal boundaries differ. But the fascination with bodies under pressure, with risk, with conflict sharpened for collective viewing, has not vanished from human life. What distinguishes Rome is the degree to which the state embraced and formalized this appetite. In the Colosseum, violence became public culture with imperial sponsorship. A lion killing a condemned man, a heavily armored gladiator facing a faster opponent, an arena transformed into a painted landscape of myth, the emperor making a gesture in response to pleas from crowd and combatant, these were not hidden acts. They were civic theater. The crowd loved the games because the games made Rome visible to itself. They compressed the empire's values into immediate, emotional form. They reassured spectators that order could be restored, that superiority could be displayed, that death could be watched and interpreted. They allowed fear to be mastered through distance, or at least staged as mastery. And perhaps most powerfully, they gave ordinary Romans a sense of participation in greatness. To attend the games was to inhabit the capital's magnificence. To watch imported beasts from distant lands, to see imperial generosity unfold, to sit among tens of thousands under monumental stone, this was to feel the scale of Rome itself. The crowd did not merely enjoy the Colosseum. The crowd completed it. No figures are more closely associated with the Colosseum than gladiators. Their names echo across popular imagination. Men in helmets and greaves, sweating in the sun, saluting the emperor, fighting until one falls while the crowd waits to decide his fate. It is a powerful image. It is also one of the most mythologized. To understand gladiators historically is to move beyond the caricature and into a world at once more brutal and more structured than legend suggests. First, gladiators were not all the same. They were drawn from different backgrounds and occupied different legal and social categories. Some were slaves, purchased and trained for combat. Some were prisoners of war. Some were condemned criminals forced into the arena. But others were volunteers, free men who chose, for reasons of debt, ambition, desperation, or appetite for fame, to enter gladiatorial contracts. Such men gave up or compromised their civic dignity in doing so. Gladiators, whatever their origin, existed under a form of social disgrace known as infamia. They were admired and desired by many, yet legally and morally stigmatized. This duality is essential. The gladiator embodied both shame and glamour. That contradiction fascinated Roman society. Training took place in ludi, gladiatorial schools run by lanisti, entrepreneurs or managers who bought, sold, leased, trained, and maintained fighters. The most famous of these in Rome included the great schools built near the Colosseum, especially the Ludus Magnus. These were not prisons in the simplest sense, though they were heavily controlled environments. Gladiators were valuable investments. A trained fighter represented considerable expense in food, housing, medical care, instruction, and equipment. Owners did not want them wasted cheaply. This fact alone disrupts one of the oldest myths, that every gladiatorial combat ended in death. It did not. A skilled, experienced gladiator was too valuable to throw away routinely. Of course, death remained a real and ever-present possibility. This was violent combat with lethal weapons. Serious injury was common. But many bouts ended with surrender, intervention, or adjudication. Referees oversaw matches. Rules structured engagements. Pairings were often made between complementary types to maximize skill and drama. The point was not random slaughter. The point was managed violence. Training was intense. Gladiators exercised, drilled, and sparred under professional instructors, often former gladiators themselves. They practiced with wooden weapons heavier than the real ones to develop strength and control. Diet was carefully regulated. Ancient sources suggest a carbohydrate-rich intake, heavy in grains and beans, earning some gladiators the nickname barley men. Medical care could be surprisingly sophisticated. Galen himself worked with gladiators early in his career, observing their injuries and treatment. The body of the gladiator was a tool of performance, and like any expensive tool, it was maintained. Different gladiator types had distinct equipment and fighting styles. There was the murmillo, heavily armed with large shield and helmet. The retiarius, lightly equipped with net and trident, agile and exposed. The secutor, designed specifically to face the retiarius, with a smooth helmet to avoid entanglement. The thraex, with a small shield and curved sword. The hoplomachus, drawing on Greek-inspired military aesthetics. These types were not arbitrary. They created contrast, asymmetry, and dramatic tension. Audiences recognized the styles and developed preferences. Matchups mattered. A bout was in part a contest of narrative archetypes, strength against speed, armor against agility, pressure against evasion. The visual identity of gladiators also mattered deeply. Their armor was stylized, often more theatrical than practical for battlefield use. This was performance costume as much as combat equipment. The arena transformed men into types legible at a distance to thousands of spectators. Rome was not watching private violence. It was watching choreographed roles meet in a dangerous script. And yet within that script, individuality emerged. Some gladiators became famous. Inscriptions, graffiti, and artistic depictions preserve names and records. A successful fighter could accumulate victories, earn prizes, win adoration, and even gain freedom with the wooden sword known as the rudis. Women desired them, men admired or envied them. Their images circulated on lamps and wall art. In a society obsessed with status but structured by hierarchy, the gladiator represented an unstable, dangerous route to visibility. That visibility came at a terrible cost. Gladiators lived under discipline, surveillance, and violence. They swore an oath accepting beating, burning, binding, and death by the sword. This was not metaphorical. The school was an institution of coercion. Even volunteers entered it by formal submission. Whatever glory might emerge in the arena, it rested on profound loss of autonomy. So why did some free men volunteer? Because Rome was a hard society in which debt, dishonor, and limited opportunity could make the arena look less like madness and more like a twisted chance. Fame, money, and dramatic reinvention were possible there in ways ordinary life might not allow. A man with nothing might become someone, even if only briefly, in the sand. We should also remember that the gladiators' performance carried moral significance for the audience. Romans admired virtus, a complex ideal involving courage, manliness, discipline, and excellence under pressure. A gladiator who fought bravely, endured pain without panic, and faced probable death with composure could display virtues that the audience recognized, even if his social status was degraded. This is one reason gladiatorial combat could fascinate elites who otherwise looked down on the profession. The arena became a paradoxical theater of virtue enacted by the dishonored. One of the most famous clichés surrounding gladiators is the phrase, "Those who are about to die salute you." In popular culture, this appears as a routine formula before combat. In reality, the famous line appears in our sources in a much narrower and uncertain context, associated not with ordinary gladiators in the Colosseum but with a staged naval event under Claudius. It was not the standard cry of every fighter. Again, the myth simplifies what the evidence complicates. Another enduring myth concerns the thumb gesture. Did a turned-down thumb mean death while a turned-up thumb meant life? The truth is maddeningly unclear. Ancient sources mention crowd and sponsor signaling, but the exact gestures and their meanings remain debated. The modern image of thumbs down owes more to later artistic imagination than secure historical certainty. The arena did involve public pleas and elite decision-making, but the hand language of mercy and death has been flattened by centuries of retelling. At the center of the myth, however, there remains something real. Gladiators stood in a place where the crowd's emotion and the sponsor's judgment could converge on the question of whether a wounded or defeated man would live. Even if the process was more regulated and economically constrained than legend suggests, the psychological intensity was profound. To perform under that gaze required an extraordinary psychological adaptation. And some did. That is the hardest thing to grasp. Gladiators were not merely victims pushed helplessly toward slaughter. Nor were they heroic free agents in pursuit of pure glory. They were professionals within coercive institutions, navigating a world that exploited their bodies while rewarding their skill. Some hated it. Some endured it. Some mastered it. Some became stars. We can see fragments of their lives in epitaphs. A fighter remembered by his stage name. A tally of victories. A note of his homeland. A memorial erected by a wife, a lover, a fellow gladiator, a trainer. These inscriptions, small and personal beside the colossal venue, remind us that the arena's figures were not symbols alone. They ate, slept, bled, feared, boasted, and dreamed. The Colosseum made them visible, but it also transformed them into symbols. Rome saw in them the body under discipline, the individual submitted to spectacle, the possibility that greatness and degradation might inhabit the same skin. That is why gladiators endure in memory. Not simply because they fought, but because they stood where fear, fame, coercion, and courage became impossible to separate. Before the afternoon duels of gladiators, before the close contests that later generations romanticized, the arena often belonged to animals. The venations, beast hunts and staged encounters with wild creatures, were among the most spectacular and logistically demanding features of Roman arena culture. They offered something gladiatorial combat did not, the thrill of the exotic. Here, the empire displayed not merely disciplined men but dominion over nature itself, or at least the performance of such dominion. If the gladiator represented controlled violence within human society, the beast represented the dangerous outside. Lions from North Africa. Leopards. Panthers. Bears. Boars. Wolves. Buffalo. Ostriches. Crocodiles on rare occasions. Elephants. Perhaps even rhinoceroses or hippopotamuses in special displays. Ancient texts and images, however embellished at times, leave no doubt that the Roman appetite for animal spectacle was immense. The farther from Rome the creature came, the greater the wonder it could produce. This was not accidental. Empire made such spectacles possible. To stage a hunt in the Colosseum required networks extending across continents. Animals had to be captured alive in distant provinces or client territories, transported overland to ports, shipped across seas, moved again by road or river, housed temporarily, fed, controlled, and kept alive long enough to appear. Many must have died in transit. Others arrived maimed or weakened. The scale of suffering behind such displays is difficult to exaggerate. Capturing wild animals was itself a dangerous industry. Hunters, trappers, local specialists, soldiers, and contractors all played roles. Techniques varied by species and terrain. Pits, nets, traps, pursuit, and enclosure were used. Young animals might be taken and raised for easier transport. Adult predators demanded greater care and risk. Every stage of the process required labor and expertise, and every stage reflected Rome's ability to compel human and natural resources toward urban pleasure. Once in Rome, the animals entered an economy of spectacle. There were dealers, handlers, trainers, and bestiarii, fighters or performers who faced animals in the arena. Some bestiarii were skilled professionals. Others were condemned persons thrown into lethal encounters as punishment. Again, distinction matters. Not every human-animal confrontation was the same. Some were managed demonstrations of hunting prowess. Some were choreographed scenes. Some were pure execution. What did the audience see? At the simplest level, they saw danger. A large predator in the arena radiated unpredictability. That alone thrilled spectators. But the hunts were often more elaborate than an animal simply being released and killed. Scenery could be introduced. Artificial rocks, trees, and landscape effects might create a stylized wilderness. Hunters could appear in mythological costume. Several animals might be set against each other or against men in ways designed to surprise. The arena transformed into a theater of nature under human control, or at least under Roman staging. Yet the logic of the hunts was never just entertainment. It was ideological. Rome had conquered territories from Britain to Syria, from the Rhine to the Sahara. In the arena, the empire condensed that geographic vastness into immediate sensation. Here was Africa. Here was the East. Here was wilderness brought into submission at the center of civilization. The imported beast stood in for lands and peoples beyond Rome's boundaries. To display and kill it was to dramatize dominion. One can hear the imperial boast beneath the roar of the crowd, "The world is ours, because even its monsters can be dragged into our city and made to die for our amusement." This was environmental domination as public theater. It came at a staggering ecological cost. Modern scholarship has increasingly paid attention to the effect of Roman spectacles on animal populations, especially in North Africa. Lions, leopards, elephants, and other species were hunted intensively over centuries for games and triumphs. Arena culture was not the only cause of decline in these species' regional numbers, but it was undeniably part of a pattern of exploitation on a massive scale. The empire consumed not only human labor and provincial wealth, but entire ecologies. Roman writers occasionally describe especially memorable animal events. Titus's inaugural games reportedly featured thousands of animals killed over many days. Such numbers are difficult to verify in detail, and ancient authors delighted in exaggeration. But even allowing for rhetorical inflation, the scale was enormous. One day's spectacle might consume more animal life than a local community would encounter in years. Not all the hunts ended with human victory. Animals could and did kill handlers, hunters, or condemned participants. That risk was part of the attraction. The arena offered controlled danger, but only controlled up to a point. A charging bull, a panicked elephant, or a lion refusing its expected role could disrupt the script. Those moments may have delighted crowds even more, because they suggested that nature still possessed a will of its own, however briefly. Elephants especially occupied a complicated place in Roman emotional life. Their intelligence and apparent dignity made them capable of provoking pity as well as wonder. There are ancient anecdotes of crowds disturbed by the suffering of elephants in games, as though some line of cruelty had become too visible to ignore. Such moments remind us again that the Roman audience was not a single unthinking organism. Spectacle could produce discomfort as well as delight. Still, the system endured because the political and emotional rewards were immense. For emperors, animal hunts were useful precisely because they were expensive. Only vast wealth and extensive networks could secure such creatures. Sponsoring grand hunts advertised imperial reach. It told the people that their ruler commanded the world's abundance and dangers alike. For spectators, the hunts expanded the sensory range of the amphitheater. The smell of animals, the unpredictability of their movement, the visual novelty of unfamiliar species, the contrast between trained human action and brute animal force, all this differentiated the morning shows from later combats. The Colosseum became a place where the known and unknown met under Roman supervision. There is also a darker psychological truth. Animal hunts allowed the crowd to enjoy death without the full moral complication of watching fellow citizens or admired gladiators die. The beast could be admired, feared, marveled at, and then killed as other. It was a safe target for domination. In destroying it, Rome reassured itself that civilization remained superior to the wild. But the animals were not symbols alone. They were living creatures torn from distant worlds, subjected to confinement, hunger, transportation, panic, and slaughter. To modern eyes, the venations often appear even more disturbing than gladiatorial combat because the animals had no role in the human moral scripts being enacted. They did not consent, compete, or signify in their own terms. They were made to bear Roman meaning. And perhaps that is the real point. The Colosseum did not simply display empire. It metabolized it. Land became plunder. Plunder became stone. Captives became labor. Animals became spectacle. Distant worlds became local entertainment. Nothing remained wholly itself once Rome had taken hold of it. Everything could be translated into proof of Roman command. Even a lion. Even an elephant. Even the wild itself. Between the wonder of the morning hunts and the high drama of the afternoon gladiatorial combats lay the hour many ancient observers found the most disturbing. Midday. The sun high. The crowd restless. The atmosphere changed. The stagecraft often simplified. And into the arena came those who were not celebrated combatants, not trained stars, not admired professionals, but the condemned. This was the domain of public execution. Modern retellings often compress all arena violence into a single category, but the Romans did not. Executions occupied a distinct place in the day's program and in the moral logic of spectacle. The condemned were not there to display skill, though some might struggle. They were there to suffer punishment visibly. Their deaths were examples, warnings, proofs that the state's power extended into flesh. The legal category of those sent into the arena varied. Some were criminals condemned ad bestias, to the beasts. Others were sentenced to the sword, to staged combats, or to mythological reenactments ending in death. Some may have been rebels, brigands, deserters, arsonists, or people judged to have committed especially serious offenses. Social status mattered enormously in Roman punishment. The law was not neutral. High-status offenders might receive relatively dignified death. Low-status people could be mutilated, exposed, or executed publicly. The arena thus reproduced not only justice, but social hierarchy within justice. This is crucial. Roman punishment was theatrical because Roman power was theatrical. To punish in private would not satisfy the same political need. The state wanted its capacity for violence seen. It wanted the crowd to feel the line between law-abiding person and condemned body. It wanted terror to educate. Ancient sources describe a range of execution methods in arenas. Some condemned were exposed unarmed or poorly armed to wild animals. Others participated in scripted scenes drawn from myth. A man might be cast as Orpheus torn by beasts, or as some notorious bandit slain in a stylized reenactment. This blending of punishment and performance could appear grotesquely imaginative. It allowed Roman audiences to consume death not only as law but as narrative entertainment. Seneca's disgust at midday spectacles is revealing here. He portrays a space stripped of the more honorable elements present in gladiatorial combat. No helmets, no defensive skill, no mutual contest, just naked cruelty. Men sent in to die under circumstances that denied them even the dignity of resistance. His moral revulsion is powerful precisely because it captures something raw. At midday the arena's cruelty became harder to decorate. And yet the crowd watched. Why? Because execution satisfied multiple Roman desires at once. It punished. It instructed. It entertained. It filled the program. It reaffirmed social boundaries. It dramatized imperial or judicial authority. Above all, it transformed abstraction into body. Crime was no longer a legal category but a bleeding fact in the sand. The condemned were often socially dead before they died physically. They had been stripped of status, protection, and sympathy. The arena completed that process by making them public matter. That is why execution as spectacle is one of the clearest windows into Roman state violence. Here we see a society not simply failing to hide punishment, but insisting on its visibility as part of civic life. There was also an economic logic. Condemned persons could serve the games at little cost compared to trained gladiators. Their deaths required no long-term maintenance, no concern for preserving investment, no need to cultivate future fame. They were expendable material for the arena. In this sense, midday executions reveal the full range of the Colosseum's human economy. At one end stood highly trained gladiators whose bodies were valuable. At the other stood condemned bodies valued mainly as occasions for display. The contrast itself taught the audience how to rank human life. We should not imagine all condemned persons facing death with equal passivity. Some must have screamed. Some begged. Some resisted desperately. Some perhaps tried to perform courage under impossible conditions. Ancient and later Christian narratives sometimes emphasize noble endurance in the face of execution, and while such accounts are often shaped by literary and theological agendas, it would be absurd to deny that some condemned people did in fact confront death with dignity. The arena could not entirely control the meaning of suffering, even when it tried. That uncertainty is part of what made public execution powerful. The state staged punishment, but the condemned body still had the potential to generate pity, disgust, or admiration. Not always, not reliably, but enough to matter. If a criminal looked pathetic, the crowd might laugh. If he looked brave, the meaning could shift. Spectacle was managed, never absolute. The Christian martyr stories associated with Roman arenas belong partly here, though we will examine them in detail later. What matters for now is that the amphitheater became, in later memory, one of the possible sites where imperial punishment collided with moral witness. Even if specific tales are often exaggerated or misplaced, the basic structure was real. A public venue of death could become a stage where the state intended humiliation and observers later remembered holiness. Midday executions also sharpened the emotional architecture of the day. After the excitement of the hunts, the execution hour could feel crueler, uglier, more punitive. Then the afternoon combats brought back skill, prestige, and suspense. The sequence intensified each part by contrast. The audience moved through different relations to violence, wonder at animals, contempt or horror at punishment, admiration and excitement at gladiatorial display. This complexity matters because it reminds us that the Colosseum was not a single experience. It was a carefully curated emotional progression. Still, the executions reveal a truth no amount of architectural admiration should obscure. The arena was an arm of the Roman state's coercive power. It did not simply host violence chosen by participants. It also staged violence imposed on the powerless. The condemned were among the least protected people in Roman society, and the amphitheater transformed their deaths into public utility. There is something chilling about that utility. A body became a lesson. A scream became entertainment. A sentence became theater. And the audience, arranged by rank beneath imperial oversight, absorbed the message. This too was Rome. Not just marble and engineering, not just law and roads, but punishment made visible and meaningful through crowd reaction. The Colosseum did not create this logic. It perfected it. At midday, beneath the sun, the empire showed what happened to those who fell outside its order. And it made sure everyone was watching. Few claims about the Colosseum are repeated more often, or with more confidence, than the idea that the entire arena could be flooded for grand mock naval battles. It is a compelling image. Ships gliding beneath the towering tiers. Oars splashing where gladiators normally fought. Thousands of spectators watching miniature fleets collide in the heart of Rome. The image appears in documentaries, illustrations, novels, and films because it seems to capture Roman extravagance perfectly. And like many compelling images, it is based on a truth tangled with misunderstanding. Mock naval battles, or naumachii, absolutely existed in Roman culture. They predate the Colosseum and were staged by powerful rulers as breathtaking demonstrations of wealth and control. Julius Caesar staged one in a specially excavated basin. Augustus did likewise on an even grander scale, creating a massive artificial lake across the Tiber. Claudius famously staged a naval spectacle on Lake Fucinus. These events were rare, expensive, and logistically extraordinary. They involved ships, combatants, scenery, and immense preparations. The Roman appetite for spectacle certainly embraced the naval form. So did the Colosseum ever host such a thing? The answer is, perhaps, but not in the simple way modern imagination assumes. Ancient sources, especially Dio Cassius and Suetonius, imply that Titus's inaugural games included water-related spectacles or mock naval displays. This has encouraged generations of writers to picture the completed Colosseum as a kind of giant convertible basin. But archaeology complicates that image dramatically. The permanent hypogeum, the underground network of corridors, cages, lifts, and machinery beneath the arena floor, would have made large-scale flooding impossible. Once that substructure existed in full form, the arena was no place for ships. This leads to the crucial distinction. The Colosseum we imagine from its mature imperial phase, with its elaborate underground mechanisms, was not well suited to naval battle flooding. But the earliest phase of the building, at the time of Titus's opening, may not yet have had the full permanent hypogeum later added under Domitian. If so, a simpler underlying arena arrangement could have allowed limited flooding or water spectacle of some sort before those modifications. Even then, caution is necessary. What kind of water display are we talking about? Not necessarily full-scale warships clashing in deep water beneath the stands. The arena's dimensions and likely depth constraints make the grandest versions unlikely. More plausible are shallow spectacles, smaller craft, staged scenes, or heavily choreographed aquatic displays that later writers remembered and amplified. The Romans were masters of illusion. A hint of water, boats, costumed fighters, and theatrical framing could generate an impression larger than the engineering reality. And Roman authors loved magnification. When they wrote of imperial games, they wrote for effect. Numbers ballooned. Rarities multiplied. Wonders became total. This is not to accuse them simply of invention. It is to recognize that literary spectacle and actual spectacle can differ. Ancient descriptions often preserve a genuine event refracted through rhetorical expectations. By the time Domitian completed the hypogeum, however, the arena's operational logic changed decisively. Beneath the wooden floor lay corridors running lengthwise and crosswise, animal cages, holding chambers, elevators, winches, trapdoors, and complex service spaces. The floor itself became a stage above machinery, not a basin awaiting water. This allowed increasingly sophisticated surprise entries, scenic reveals, and rapid changes of action. The price of that sophistication was the likely end of any substantial flooding. So why does the naval myth persist so strongly? Because it fits the Roman brand. The Colosseum already seems like a place where anything might be possible. Add an emperor eager to astonish, ancient reports of water spectacle, and the modern love of superlatives, and the story becomes irresistible. A stadium that becomes a lake feels like the perfect symbol of imperial excess. It also flatters our sense of Roman technical genius. We want them to have done it because it confirms the building's reputation as impossibly versatile. In truth, the more interesting story may be about transition. The earliest Colosseum may have briefly preserved a degree of flexibility inherited from older arena traditions, including some kind of aquatic display before the fully developed substructure fixed the building's later identity. But the mature amphitheater chose another direction. It became a place not of flooding, but of hidden mechanisms, vertical surprise, and carefully engineered illusion. Water, in other words, gave way to machinery. The real marvel was not that the Colosseum could become a sea. It was that the Romans found other ways to make the impossible seem ordinary. And that brings us to one of the most famous moments in the building's early life, the games with which Titus presented the amphitheater to Rome. In 80 CE, the Flavian amphitheater opened to the Roman world. Vespasian, who had initiated the project, was dead. The honor of dedication fell to his elder son Titus, fresh from military glory in Judea and newly tested by the burdens of rule. Titus inherited not only an empire but a task, to convert his father's monumental gamble into emotional fact. A building existed. Now it had to live. The opening games did that. Ancient sources tell us that Titus inaugurated the amphitheater with spectacles of extraordinary scale, extending over many days, often remembered as 100. Modern historians debate how literally we should take the numbers attached to these celebrations, just as we question all ancient numerical claims about slaughter and attendance. Yet even if some totals were embellished, the essential reality is clear. The opening was meant to overwhelm. It was not enough for the Flavians to present a new venue. They had to fill it with such abundance that the city would never forget the gift. This is how monumental politics works. Architecture is only the first statement. Use is the second. Imagine the first great crowds approaching the gleaming structure. The travertine still bright. Decorative surfaces still fresh. Statues in place. The smell of lime, timber, paint, sweat, perfume, and dust mingling in the air. Rome did not yet look at the amphitheater with historical reverence. It looked at it with appetite. What would this machine do? Titus's answer was simple. Everything. Accounts speak of gladiatorial combats, animal hunts, executions, perhaps aquatic displays or at least water-themed spectacles, lavish distributions, and repeated surprises. Thousands of animals were reportedly killed during the inaugural festivities. Such figures should not be accepted without caution, but they tell us what mattered to Roman memory: abundance, range, extravagance beyond ordinary expectation. The opening games were not just entertainment. They were a dynastic oath spoken in blood and marvel. Titus himself had reason to cultivate popular affection. Though later ancient writers often remembered him as relatively benevolent, his accession came with the familiar uncertainties of imperial succession. He was associated with military force, with his father's rise, and with the brutal end of the Jewish revolt. He needed to be seen not only as commander but as benefactor. The opening of the amphitheater allowed him to appear magnanimous, accessible, and splendidly generous at once. This was especially important because 80 CE also brought disaster. That same year, Mount Vesuvius erupted, burying Pompeii, Herculaneum, and neighboring communities beneath ash and pumice. Soon after came a major fire in Rome and a serious outbreak of disease. Titus's reign, though brief, unfolded under the shadow of calamity. Public generosity mattered not only as display but as reassurance. The emperor must appear capable of answering disaster with abundance. The opening games helped create that image. Ancient descriptions linger on variety because variety itself was part of the gift. Morning hunts offered novelty and exotic danger. Midday punishments reaffirmed order. Afternoon combats restored the prestige of professional skill. Scenic effects and staged surprises turned the arena into a series of worlds. One moment Africa. Another moment mythology. Another moment judicial terror. Then athletic courage. The amphitheater became a rotating empire of impressions. And all of it was free. Or more precisely, free to the audience in direct payment. The political economy was entirely different from modern commercial spectacle. Spectators did not buy tickets in a market system. Access depended on allocations, patronage, status, and public arrangements. The emperor or sponsor paid the cost because the cost itself generated political meaning. The people did not purchase the event. They received it, and by receiving it, entered a relationship of obligation, gratitude, and evaluation. This gave the crowd power of a particular kind. Not democratic power, certainly, but interpretive power. A sponsor who failed to satisfy risked embarrassment. A sponsor who astonished could claim memory itself. Titus wanted memory. So what did those first days feel like? We must be careful. Ancient sources provide fragments, not a camera. But from those fragments and from what we know of Roman spectacle more broadly, we can reconstruct something of the emotional architecture. First came scale. To sit among tens of thousands in a purpose-built amphitheater at the center of Rome was itself overwhelming. The building gathered the city and then focused it on a sand-covered void awaiting action. Every eye pulled inward. Then came rhythm. Trumpets. Processions. Official appearances. Costumes. The release of animals. The first shouts from the crowd as novelty gave way to danger. Dust rising. Blood darkening sand. Bodies entering and leaving. Intervals for resetting the stage. The spectator was not watching a single event but being carried through a carefully composed sequence. Then came surprise, one of the most important Roman tools of spectacle. Trapdoors or temporary scenic devices could make figures appear suddenly. Animals could emerge in unexpected combinations. Costumed performers could transform a hunt into myth. Roman spectacle delighted in controlled astonishment. It wanted the audience to feel that imperial resources were inexhaustible, that one marvel could always be followed by another. There was also the deeper symbolic level. Titus was not simply giving games. He was activating the promise embedded in the building from the beginning. Nero had privatized the center of the city. The Flavians had reclaimed it. Now the reclaimed space was full of people, sound, violence, and gratitude. Architecture had become civic fact. The inaugural games also revealed something fundamental about the Colosseum's future. This would not be an occasional curiosity. It would become one of the central institutions of Roman urban life, a place where emperors and people encountered one another through the medium of spectacle. The first opening had to teach Rome how to use the building, how to desire it, how to remember it as necessary. And it succeeded. The amphitheater quickly became inseparable from the city's identity. Later emperors would add, repair, restore, and exploit it. Later generations would mythologize its early days. But Titus's inauguration fixed the emotional template. The Colosseum was a place where the impossible might happen, where imperial generosity took visible form, and where Roman power felt most immediate. Yet the building Titus opened was not quite the one later Rome would know best. For beneath the arena, something else was still to come. The mature Colosseum, the one of sudden beast lifts, hidden cages, mechanized reveals, and the full backstage world of controlled surprise, belonged above all to Domitian. When people imagine the Colosseum, they usually picture the arena as a great open floor of sand. But in its most famous form, that floor was less a surface than a lid. Below it lay one of the most remarkable service systems of the ancient world. This subterranean complex, known today as the Hypogeum, was largely developed under Domitian, Titus's younger brother and successor. If Vespasian gave the amphitheater its political birth, and Titus its public consecration, Domitian gave it mechanical depth. He transformed the building from a monumental shell into a fully realized theater of concealed operations. Domitian's reign often carries a darker reputation in ancient literary tradition. Senators disliked him. Later authors shaped his memory accordingly, portraying him as suspicious, autocratic, and theatrical in his own way. Yet whatever the moral judgments of hostile sources, he was an energetic builder and administrator. His modifications to the Colosseum were practical, ambitious, and enduring. The Hypogeum consisted of two main levels of underground corridors and chambers running beneath the arena floor. Here were cages for animals, holding rooms for fighters and condemned persons, storage for scenery and equipment, service routes for attendants, and a system of lifts and trapdoors capable of producing dramatic appearances above. The arena spectators watched the surface. The machinery of wonder operated below. This is one of the building's great conceptual achievements. The visible world of spectacle depended on an invisible world of labor. The wooden arena floor, covered with sand, concealed a labyrinth. At carefully planned points, trapdoors could open. Platforms worked by capstans, pulleys, and counterweight systems could raise animals in cages or scenic elements upward into the arena. A spectator might see an empty landscape one moment and a bear, panther, or armed performer appear the next as though by magic. Rome loved revelation, and Domitian gave it architecture that specialized in surprise. Archaeological remains suggest dozens of lift positions and complex alignments. Some mechanisms may have been relatively simple by modern standards, wooden platforms hauled by teams of men using rope and rotational force, but simple does not mean unimpressive. To coordinate multiple hidden elevators, animals, handlers, scenery, and timing beneath a crowded live arena required discipline and expertise of a high order. The Hypogeum also transformed the nature of the shows above. Once the underground structure was permanent, large-scale flooding of the arena became implausible. But in return, the building gained flexibility of another kind. It could stage serial reveals, rapid transitions, hidden preparations, and choreographed appearances with far greater control than a simpler arena could manage. And that control mattered. Roman spectacle was not only about magnitude. It was about pacing. Surprise released too early was wasted. Delay could build suspense. The hidden world below the floor allowed the visible world above to seem spontaneous while in fact being minutely organized. This is theater in its deepest sense: conceal the labor, reveal the effect. Domitian also added structures around the amphitheater that integrated it more fully into Rome's entertainment district. Nearby stood gladiatorial schools such as the Ludus Magnus, connected or closely linked by passages. Training, preparation, confinement, and performance all became part of a wider institutional ecosystem. The Colosseum was not an isolated object. It was the center of a larger machine. There is something psychologically important here too. The Hypogeum embodies Roman fascination with mastery over emergence. The dangerous thing is hidden. Then, at the chosen instant, it appears. A beast rises from darkness into light. A performer seems to materialize from nowhere. The arena becomes a place where command over timing feels almost divine. This was politically useful. Emperors staged themselves as masters not only of force but of revelation. The Colosseum under Domitian became an imperial theater of controlled unpredictability. The crowd could be startled again and again, but only because unseen workers below were exhausting themselves to keep surprise alive. And these workers mattered. Rope haulers, carpenters, animal handlers, stage managers, signal givers, guards, sweepers, repair crews, and attendants all moved through a space that no ordinary spectator saw. While the audience read imperial generosity and cosmic order in the arena above, the underground world sweated, cursed, hauled, fed, cleaned, and improvised. We often speak of Roman engineering as though it were abstract brilliance. But the hypogeum reminds us that engineering is social. Mechanisms do not operate themselves. Someone has to turn the capstan. Someone has to release the latch. Someone has to calm the panicked animal below the floor while thousands roar overhead. It is likely that those underground spaces were hot, dim, and terrifying. Animals could smell blood and fear. Men awaiting execution or combat might hear the crowd before ever seeing the arena. Chains rattled. Wood creaked. Ropes strained. Orders were whispered or shouted. Sand filtered down through cracks. The great bright world above rested on a basement of anxiety. Domitian's additions thus completed a paradox already present in the building from the start. The Colosseum appeared as public splendor, but functioned through hidden compulsion. It promised civic magnificence, but depended on backstage confinement. It displayed order, but its order required a constant struggle against accident, panic, and animal unpredictability. The more one understands the hypogeum, the harder it becomes to see the Colosseum as merely a bowl for viewing combat. It was closer to a total performance system, a stadium, prison, machine room, menagerie, stage, and political theater fused into one architectural organism. And beneath the cheers, beneath the sunlight, beneath the drifting sand, the real secret was this. The Colosseum worked because so much of it remained unseen. That hidden labor, that hidden fear, that hidden machinery, those are where we must go next. The arena above was glory. The world below was work. The sentence that followed them into darkness was one they could not refuse. If the gladiator was the visible star of the amphitheater, the backstage worker was its invisible muscle. The Colosseum depended on an entire population of people whom the audience was not meant to notice. Their success was measured precisely in their disappearance. When the mechanism worked, no one applauded the men turning the winch. When an animal appeared at the exact desired moment, the crowd marveled at imperial magnificence, not at the exhausted crew below. Hidden labor was the condition of visible wonder. Let us imagine the underground hours before dawn. Long before the first spectators approached the arches, the service world of the amphitheater was awake. Lamps burned in subterranean passages. Guards moved between holding rooms. Handlers checked cages. Rope teams inspected pulleys, platforms, trapdoor hinges, and release mechanisms. Carpenters listened for warping in the wooden systems and repaired what the previous day had damaged. Sweepers removed clotted sand, blood, dung, and debris from every reachable surface. Scribes or supervisors consulted the order of the day, what animals would appear first, which scenery pieces were needed, which condemned prisoners were to be held at what time, which gladiators were expected in the afternoon. Nothing about such labor was glamorous. It was heavy, repetitive, urgent, and dangerous. The mechanisms themselves, though ingenious, were not magical. A platform lift for a cage or scenic element required coordinated human force. Men heaved at ropes, turned capstans, braced feet against timber, and responded to shouted signals. A mistimed lift could jam. A broken rope could maim. An animal that panicked too soon could injure handlers in a confined space. A trapdoor not properly secured could endanger whoever stood above it. The entire underground system demanded constant vigilance because the margin between spectacle and disaster was narrow. Animal handlers lived closest to danger. Imagine trying to contain a leopard in dim heat while the vibrations of the crowd begin overhead. Imagine the smell of lion musk, elephant waste, damp straw, sweat, oil, and fear. Imagine knowing that in a few minutes your task is to place that creature onto a lift platform or align a cage beneath the correct opening and trust that the release will happen as planned. The Empire's mastery over nature, so theatrically advertised above ground, was in practice a daily struggle by frightened human beings against equally frightened beasts. Some underground workers were probably enslaved. Others may have been wage laborers, imperial employees, or attached specialists with particular expertise. Roman institutions rarely relied on a single labor status. What they shared was subordination. Whatever their formal condition, these workers served an apparatus whose glory belonged elsewhere. Then there were the human bodies awaiting exposure. Condemned prisoners may have spent hours below the arena hearing distant noise, smelling animals, and trying to understand from scraps of sound what fate approached. Gladiators, though better housed and far more valuable, would also have passed through backstage spaces where public identity had not yet settled upon them. Before the applause, before the polished image of courage, there was preparation, armor buckled, wounds wrapped, helmets checked, nerves managed. The hypogeum was where men stopped being ordinary bodies and were sorted into roles. This backstage sorting reveals something essential about the Colosseum. It was not simply a place where violence happened. It was a place where violence was produced. Like any theater, it required sequence, timing, and transformation. A bare arena became a forest scene because teams carried in scenery. An empty floor became a site of terror because a hidden cage rose into light. A gladiatorial pairing became legible because armorers, trainers, and attendants made sure the correct equipment, costume, and choreography were in place. Every spontaneous thrill was manufactured by work. We should also think about communication. Complex live events require signaling systems. Spoken orders were one method, but in noisy conditions visual signals, prearranged timings, or chains of relayed commands must have been crucial. Someone in authority decided when the next reveal would happen. Someone else communicated that downward. In the delay between command and appearance lay the entire tension of performance. The crowd above saw only the result. Below, men waited in strained concentration for the cue that would turn concealment into impact. Maintenance never ended. Wood swells and cracks. Ropes fray. Iron rusts. Sand abrades. Blood makes surfaces slippery. Animal waste degrades air and materials alike. The Colosseum systems therefore required not one act of brilliant design but ongoing repair culture. Without daily maintenance, the machinery of wonder would fail quickly. Roman engineering survives in our imagination because we see stone. But the daily functioning of the amphitheater depended heavily on perishable materials, especially wood and fiber. Those materials demanded constant care. This means the Colosseum's backstage world was temporal in a way the ruin is not. It wore down. It had to be renewed. It aged. It broke. Men cursed at it. Men learned its habits. A particular lift may have been notorious for sticking in wet weather. A certain hatch may have required a harder shove than newer crews expected. Knowledge lived in bodies and routines as much as in design. There is almost certainly an entire history of practical improvisation beneath the arena that the sources do not preserve. Ancient authors loved marvels but rarely recorded the technicians who made marvels possible. No one wrote a literary masterpiece about the rope crew. Yet the rope crew was there. One of the most striking consequences of the underground system was the transformation of the audience's relationship to causality. If a beast or performer could appear suddenly through the floor, the arena became a place where surfaces lied. The sand no longer told the whole truth. The ground itself might open. The visible world became unstable. This instability magnified the emotional power of the shows. A spectator could never be entirely certain what the arena concealed. Such uncertainty is theatrical gold. It also hints at something psychologically darker. Roman spectators were not merely watching men confront death, they were watching death arrive from below. The arena floor became a membrane between ordered public life and a shadow world of danger, confinement, and mechanism. When trapdoors opened, that shadow world briefly erupted into light. In this sense, the Colosseum was a machine for revelation in the literal and political sense. The hidden was made visible at the ruler's chosen moment. Control over emergence symbolized control over chaos. And yet the system was fragile because all systems built on living bodies are fragile. If one handler lost control, if one platform failed, if one frightened animal broke the sequence, the illusion of total command could fracture. This is why backstage labor was not secondary to Roman power but constitutive of it. Empire is not only decrees and monuments. It is maintenance. It is scheduling. It is the ability to make one event follow another on time before a crowd waiting to be impressed. So when we picture the Colosseum, we should picture two theaters at once. Above, sunlight, hierarchy, applause, marble, spectacle. Below, darkness, labor, smell, fear, and the grinding conversion of effort into surprise. The first made Rome feel eternal. The second kept Rome from falling apart for another day. History is often written as though people in the past experienced their world through concepts alone. But the Colosseum was sensory before it was intellectual. To enter it was to be overwhelmed not simply by meaning, but by sound, glare, texture, odor, proximity, and rhythm. Before a Roman spectator formed a judgment about courage, justice, or imperial generosity, the body had already been seized by the environment. Let us reconstruct a day. The morning begins with movement through the city. Vendors set up near the approach roads. Dust rises from sandals and hooves. Street cries mingle with conversation. People carry cushions, food, or small belongings. Those with better seats move with more assurance. Those climbing to the upper tiers know they must arrive early enough to secure comfort within discomfort. At the entrances, there is compression. Shadow under the arches. The coolness of interior vaults after the outdoor light. The smell of stone and damp passageways. Then upward through stairs, around corridors, toward the opening where the seating bowl suddenly reveals itself in brightness. And what a brightness it must have been. The arena sand, pale and broad, reflecting the sun. Marble seating and painted surfaces catching light. Metal fittings flashing. Costumes colored vividly. Blood, when it came, shocking precisely because of the brightness around it. The Colosseum was not lit for mood. It operated in the uncompromising visibility of day. Nothing softened the scene except perhaps the great awning overhead where deployed. That awning, the velarium, deserves a sensory place of its own. Stretched by sailors or trained rigging crews using masts and ropes fixed around the upper structure, it did not seal the entire space like a roof. Instead it provided patterned shade over portions of the seating. One can imagine the cloth billowing slightly in wind, ropes creaking, patches of sun shifting as the day progressed. Spectators would feel the difference immediately between exposed and shaded sections. Shade was not an abstraction. It was physical relief. The emperor who supplied it supplied comfort itself. Then the sound begins to build. Not one sound, but layers. Trumpets for ceremony. Shouts from vendors. Laughter from groups spotting friends in distant rows. Murmurs rolling like water across stone. The bark or roar of animals kept just out of sight. Commands from attendants. The metallic clink of arms. At moments of suspense the crowd might tighten into a collective intake of breath. At moments of climax it would explode. Tens of thousands of voices in a curved stone bowl create their own weather. Applause becomes thunder. Hissing becomes a vast serpentine force. Chants can roll from section to section. Individual cries disappear into atmosphere unless emotion sharpens them enough to break through. A wounded gladiator raising a hand to appeal. A beast rushing unexpectedly close to the barrier. A condemned man failing, pleading, or astonishing the crowd with calm. Each event produces a different soundscape. There was also the sound of work. Rakes on sand. Doors slamming below. Cages scraping. Timber thudding. Ropes under strain. The quick feet of attendants removing bodies or equipment between acts. The arena was never silent unless silence itself became dramatic. And then the smell. We should not sanitize it. The Colosseum smelled of humanity first: sweat, breath, oil, cheap wine, perfume, wool, leather, and bodies packed close for hours. Add to that the animals: dung, urine, musk, wet fur, feed, fear. Add blood, opened entrails, fresh sand laid over old stains, rotting remnants not yet cleared away, and the smoke or odor of food from nearby vendors. Add heat baking all of it beneath a Mediterranean sun. The result would have been thick, at times nauseating, and ever-changing depending on wind, weather, and what phase of the day was underway. Ancient audiences were more accustomed than we are to strong bodily odors in public, but accustomed does not mean unaware. Smell-shaped experience. The approach of animals might be sensed before seen. The aftermath of combat might carry its own metallic tang. Midday executions in the heat may have been especially foul. Fragrant oils, incense on certain ceremonial occasions, or the perfumes of elites would not erase this mixture. They would simply sit within it. Touch mattered too. Stone seats warming through the day. The roughness of stair rails and walls. The grain of cushions brought by wealthier spectators. The scratch of clothing. Dust settling on skin. If the crowd surged or shifted, bodies pressed against one another. Those in the upper tiers might feel wind more sharply, those lower down, the radiating heat from sand and bodies. Time in the Colosseum was therefore bodily time. Hunger, thirst, fatigue, excitement, and discomfort all affected perception. A spectator in the topmost reaches after hours of heat would receive the same spectacle differently from a senator seated near the arena in comparative comfort. Social hierarchy was felt not only as honor but as bodily experience. Visual rhythm also structured the day. Morning light can be clear and high, making colors vivid and movement crisp. By midday the sun becomes punishing, flattening shadows, intensifying glare. In the later afternoon, if games ran long, light begins to tilt and soften. Blood looks different under changing sun. Armor flashes differently. Dust turns golden. The emotional tone of the arena may have shifted with the angle of light as much as with the program itself. We should imagine pauses as well. Moments when the crowd ate, talked, gossiped, speculated. Who would fight next? Was the emperor pleased? Had anyone seen a beast like that before? Was a favorite gladiator appearing later? Spectacle was punctuated by sociality. People came not only to watch but to be there, to witness the city witnessing itself. Children must have attended. So did elders, clients, patrons, soldiers, merchants, travelers, and women seated where law and custom pushed them. The Colosseum was not some pure chamber of violent concentration. It was messy, social, distracted, repetitive, and punctuated by astonishing moments. Like any large public event, it mixed boredom with tension, routine with shock. This mixture helps explain why the greatest spectacles mattered so much. In a long day, the extraordinary burns brighter. An unexpected reversal, a moment of bravery, the release of a rare animal, a dramatic execution scene, the personal appearance of the emperor, such incidents punctured the fabric of ordinary waiting and became memory. The rest formed the necessary texture through which wonder could strike. One should also imagine the end of day. The crowd filtering out. The arena smelling worse than before. Workers already beginning cleanup. Blood-darkened sand raked over or removed. Broken equipment gathered. Bodies taken away through specialized exits. Vendors counting earnings. Spectators arguing over what they had seen. The sunlight fading on the exterior arches. Rome absorbing once more the event it had collectively experienced. And by night, beneath that now empty stone shell, labor beginning again. The sensory world of the Colosseum matters because it returns us from abstraction to embodiment. The arena was not merely a symbol of empire. It was a place where empire was inhaled, heard, endured, and cheered through the body. That is why the memories it generated could be so powerful. They were not ideas alone. They were experiences written into nerves. A building as large as the Colosseum can make us forget a simple question. Who paid for all this? The answer, in one sense, is easy: the emperor, the state, the empire. But such shorthand conceals the actual economic web that made Roman spectacle possible. The Colosseum was not just an architectural marvel or a political theater. It was also an enormous drain on resources, a generator of livelihoods, and a machine for converting wealth into public legitimacy. Start with the most basic fact. Spectacles in the Colosseum were expensive on a staggering scale. Animals had to be acquired, transported, housed, fed, and often replaced in large numbers. Gladiators required long-term investment in training, food, medical care, and equipment. Condemned criminals may have been cheaper, but they still required guards, processing, staging, and logistical integration. The building itself demanded maintenance: stone repairs, timber replacement, seating upkeep, awning management, drainage, security, cleaning, and the care of underground machinery. Add ceremonial extras, costumes, scenic effects, processions, musicians, attendants, and the cost rises further. Roman elites understood this. That is part of why spectacle had political value. To sponsor games was to spend visibly. It was an act of public consumption meant to generate public gratitude. In the Republic, magistrates and ambitious aristocrats often financed games to advance careers. Under the Empire, the emperor overshadowed all such generosity, though other sponsors still existed in different contexts. The Colosseum in particular became a theater where imperial scale mattered most. This means the economics of the amphitheater were not market economics in the modern entertainment sense. There were no ticket revenues balancing production costs in a profit model. The return was political, symbolic, and social. An emperor spent money not to make money directly, but to make loyalty, memory, and prestige. That does not mean no one profited. Quite the opposite. Around the great current of imperial expenditure swirled countless smaller economies. Animal dealers negotiated contracts. Transporters earned fees. Lanisti leased gladiators. Armorers produced and repaired equipment. Rope makers, carpenters, blacksmiths, leather workers, and feed suppliers all benefited from the recurring needs of spectacle. Vendors sold food and drink near the venue. Artisans produced souvenirs, lamps, or images of famous gladiators. Medical personnel served the schools. Stable workers, muleteers, cleaners, grave handlers, and cloth suppliers all found employment in the shadows of the games. The Colosseum was therefore not merely a place of consumption. It was an economic ecosystem. Consider the gladiatorial schools. A trained fighter was an asset with quantifiable value. Lanisti could lease fighters to event sponsors at prices reflecting skill and reputation. The death of such a fighter represented financial loss unless compensated. This is another reason not all bouts ended fatally. Economics disciplined bloodlust. A sponsor might want spectacle, but he also had to think about cost, contractual terms, and future availability. Roman jurists and writers sometimes discuss compensation for wounded or killed gladiators, revealing a commercial framework beneath the supposed romance of death and honor. A gladiator could be admired by crowds and still treated by owners as capital. Animal spectacle followed similar patterns on a larger and more unpredictable scale. A rare beast was prestigious precisely because it was difficult and costly to obtain. An emperor who could display multiple lions, elephants, and exotic creatures in one program advertised more than generosity. He advertised logistical reach. Each beast on the sand was also a unit of expenditure transformed into applause. There were also indirect economic benefits for the ruler. Games reinforced the urban peace. A satisfied population is easier to govern than an angry one. Public generosity could soften resentment over taxes, shortages, or political frustration. This is where the cynical reading of Bread and Circuses retains force. Spectacle could distract, but distraction itself had administrative value. At the same time, the crowd was not infinitely pliable. Games raised expectations. If emperors gave lavish spectacles, the people came to expect them. Public generosity became part of the imperial job description. To fail in that duty was not merely thrift. It could look like neglect. Maintenance of the building formed a long-term financial burden. Fires, weathering, mechanical wear, and sheer heavy use required repairs. Different emperors are known to have restored or embellished the amphitheater after damage. Such restorations were opportunities for renewed self-display. Even repair could become propaganda. To mend the Colosseum was to present oneself as guardian of Rome's civic body. What of betting? Direct evidence is patchy, but it would be astonishing if wagering did not occur in some form. Humans gamble readily on uncertain outcomes, and Roman society was no exception. While formal state organization of betting in the Colosseum is not clearly attested in the way modern sports books are, casual and perhaps more organized wagering likely accompanied gladiatorial and animal events. Such financial excitement would deepen crowd involvement, tying emotion to personal stake. The city around the Colosseum also absorbed economic energy from the games. Inns, taverns, brothels, shops, and temporary cellars all benefited from crowd concentration. Large public venues create zones of commercial opportunity. Ancient Rome was no different. On major festival days the surrounding district would have pulsed with exchange before, during, and after the event. Yet for all these secondary profits, the central fact remains: the Colosseum ran on imperial redistribution. Wealth extracted from the empire was burned, quite literally, into public experience. Grain fed the city. Taxes maintained administration. Conquest enriched the treasury. Then some of that accumulated power returned to the people as spectacle. Not equally, not justly, not without violence, but visibly. This was one of Rome's great political arts. The empire could make exploitation feel like generosity because it delivered the spoils back to the capital in dramatic form. A lion from Africa. A gladiator trained at great cost. 100 awning sailors shielding the crowd from heat. A repaired stairwell after earthquake damage. A day of games announced by imperial decree. Each of these said the same thing in different language: the ruler provides. And once that expectation was established, the ruler had to keep providing. That is why the economics of the Colosseum were never separate from its politics. The price of wonder was paid in taxes, tribute, labor, conquest, ecology, and administrative strain. The reward was not profit in coin alone, but profit in stability and memory. Rome understood that magnificence could be a form of government. And still the empire kept paying. The Colosseum was a profoundly gendered space. Not because women were absent from it, but because their presence was regulated, interpreted, and often made to signify boundaries. Roman society was intensely concerned with who could appear in public, under what conditions, and with what kind of honor. The amphitheater, as a place where the entire social body became visible to itself, sharpened all those concerns. Women attended the games. That much is beyond doubt. Elite literary sources, legal measures, and the logic of seating itself all confirm female spectatorship. But women did not attend on equal terms with men. In the social architecture of the Colosseum, most women were relegated to higher and less prestigious sections. Only the Vestal virgins, whose sacred status placed them in a category apart, received especially prominent seating. Their visible presence near the arena signaled Rome's religious order and linked spectacle to civic piety. The contrast is revealing. Ordinary women were pushed upward and outward. The Vestals were brought close. This tells us that gender in the Colosseum was not a simple binary of inclusion and exclusion. It was hierarchical and symbolic. Some women could be honored in public precisely because they embodied a controlled and sacred femininity approved by the state. Others could watch, but from a distance that reflected both modesty norms and the lower public standing assigned to them. Yet we should resist imagining female spectators as passive shadows. Women in the stands saw what men saw. They responded emotionally to favorites, to courage, to cruelty, to imperial display. Ancient authors sometimes fret about women's attraction to gladiators, a complaint that itself reveals female spectatorship as active and potentially unsettling. The gladiator's body, strong, dangerous, degraded, glamorous, could disrupt conventional Roman ideals of masculine dignity and female decorum alike. That discomfort appears again and again in elite writing. It is one of the reasons the gladiator fascinated Roman imagination so deeply. He was publicly visible in a way that respectable men were not supposed to be. His body was displayed. His wounds were watched. His sexuality was imagined and discussed. Women desiring him, or even being imagined as desiring him, intensified the profession's strange power. The Colosseum also staged female exclusion by implication. The arena dramatized courage, military coding, and command in forms overwhelmingly associated with masculinity. Even when women were present as spectators, the values on display were framed as male virtues. Martial endurance, controlled violence, bodily discipline under mortal pressure, these were virtues Roman ideology linked to manhood and citizenship, even if the actual performers were often socially degraded. And yet history complicates this neat division. There is evidence, limited, debated in detail but real in principle, for female gladiators. Ancient sources and artistic evidence indicate that women did at times appear in arena combat, especially as novelties or under exceptional circumstances. The relief from Halicarnassus depicting female fighters named Amazon and Achillea is among the most famous pieces of evidence. Literary references from authors like Suetonius and Cassius Dio suggest that elite sponsors, including emperors, sometimes arranged for women to fight in spectacles. Such appearances were sufficiently striking to be remembered precisely because they violated ordinary expectations. This is important. Female gladiators were not the norm, but they were not purely fantasy either. Why did such spectacles matter? Because they allowed Roman society to play with the boundaries of gender while also reinforcing them through exceptionalism. A woman fighting in the arena could be presented as thrilling because she was anomalous, scandalous, even slightly monstrous by elite standards. The very fact of the novelty confirmed the ordinary rule. Spectators could enjoy the transgression while preserving the framework that made it transgressive. Imperial involvement intensified this dynamic. Some emperors, especially those accused by elite authors of theatrical excess or social inversion, were said to stage lowborn women or even women of rank in humiliating or inappropriate public performances. Whether every such claim is true in every detail matters less than what the accusations reveal. Elite Romans believed that using women in the arena could symbolize a breakdown of proper order. Eventually, legal restrictions followed. Under Septimius Severus, female participation in arena combat appears to have been curtailed or banned, at least in the forms that had scandalized elite opinion. The state, having toyed with gendered novelty, reasserted limits. Women's relationship to the Colosseum therefore moved across several registers at once. As spectators, they were present but ranked. As symbols, they were part of the moral language through which Romans judged public behavior. As occasional performers, they became spectacles of inversion. As imagined admirers of gladiators, they haunted male elite anxieties about desire, discipline, and status. There is also the question of labor. Women likely existed within the wider economic ecosystem around the amphitheater in many roles not always visible in formal sources: vendors, household servants, textile workers supplying cloth, perhaps healers, in-workers, sex workers, and members of families economically tied to arena professions. A great public venue is never socially pure. It draws surrounding labor of many kinds, and women would certainly have been part of that surrounding economy. To think about women in relation to the Colosseum is therefore to think about how Rome staged visibility itself. Who may be seen? Who must be screened? Whose body is honored? Whose body is watched? Whose desire counts as dangerous? The amphitheater made such questions concrete. And it did so with characteristic Roman efficiency. A woman climbing to the upper rows experienced her place physically. A vestal in her honored seat embodied a different model of public femininity entirely. A female fighter in the arena, rare but possible, turned the whole system briefly inside out. The Colosseum did not erase women. It arranged them. And in arranging them, it revealed how deeply spectacle belonged to Rome's wider politics of gender. No figure mattered more in the Colosseum than the emperor. Even when he did nothing dramatic, his mere presence altered the meaning of the event. The amphitheater was one of the rare spaces where ruler and ruled encountered one another at scale and in relative immediacy. The emperor sat above the arena, but he also sat before the people. He watched, and was watched watching. This reciprocal gaze was politically significant. Roman emperors could not rule by force alone. However absolute their power might appear in law or military command, they still needed public acceptance, or at least public manageability, in the capital. The crowd in the amphitheater was not sovereign, but it was not irrelevant either. It could cheer, sulk, complain, petition, and compare. An emperor who appeared indifferent to public expectations risked alienation. An emperor who appeared generous, responsive, and magnificently composed could reinforce legitimacy. The Colosseum made this theater of rulership visible. The emperor's seat was not just a good view. It was a stage. From it the ruler displayed attention, composure, piety, mercy, severity, and endurance. How long he stayed mattered. Whether he seemed engaged or bored mattered. Whether he responded to supplication mattered. Spectacle was never only about the figures in the sand. It was also about the man above them interpreting Rome back to itself. An emperor at the games embodied several roles at once. He was patron, because he had funded or authorized the event. He was judge, because his reactions could shape outcomes. He was citizen among citizens, at least in the carefully managed fantasy of Roman public life. He was monarch, though Rome hated the word, because his person concentrated the political meaning of the entire gathering. This complexity helps explain why some emperors excelled in arena politics while others failed. A ruler who understood the emotional logic of public spectacle could convert the Colosseum into a machine for legitimacy. A ruler who misread it could embarrass himself spectacularly. Titus, for example, benefited from appearing generous and humane. Trajan reportedly offered grand spectacles on a scale that reinforced his image as successful ruler and benefactor. Other emperors repaired the amphitheater after damage and thereby inserted themselves into its continuing life. Restoration itself became a performance of care. But no emperor demonstrates the risks of self-performance more vividly than Commodus. If the Colosseum usually staged imperial authority from above, Commodus tried to stage it from within. His reign, from 180 to 192 CE, occupies a peculiar place in Roman memory. Later authors paint him as vain, unstable, theatrical, cruel, and dangerously attracted to spectacle. Such sources are hostile, and hostility always requires caution. Yet even allowing for exaggeration, Commodus clearly cultivated an image deeply entangled with the arena. He did not merely sponsor games. He performed in them. Ancient writers describe him fighting as a gladiator, hunting animals from protected positions, styling himself as a new Hercules, and turning public spectacle into a theater of personal obsession. Whether every anecdote is literally true matters less than the larger pattern. Commodus blurred the boundary between emperor and performer. For elite Roman opinion, this was scandalous. Why? Not because emperors were forbidden from military association, far from it. Roman rulers constantly cultivated martial prestige. The problem was that the arena was not the battlefield. It was a place of display, controlled violence, and professional fighters marked by social infamy. For the emperor to descend into that sphere was not to elevate it, it was to degrade himself. Or so elite authors insisted. Commodus seems to have embraced precisely the symbolic energy that horrified them. To appear in the amphitheater as hunter or gladiator was to claim extraordinary bodily power, direct dominance, and almost mythic presence. If he styled himself Hercules, then the arena became a place where emperor and hero merged. Lions, ostriches, and exotic beasts became props in an imperial self-portrait. But self-portrait is the crucial phrase. The Roman emperor was supposed to be the guarantor of order, not merely its most flamboyant actor. By entering the spectacle too deeply, Commodus changed the meaning of rulership. Instead of sponsoring performance, he became performance. Instead of managing symbolism, he risked being consumed by it. Ancient accounts linger on the absurdities and humiliations. Commodus allegedly fought under controlled conditions, armed advantageously, collecting gigantic fees from the state treasury for his appearances. He is said to have slaughtered animals in large numbers, even ridiculous numbers, from safe platforms or behind protective barriers, then expected admiration. Whether every detail is accurate or sharpened by hostile rhetoric, the accusations themselves show what Romans feared, that power without restraint becomes theater without dignity. There is a larger lesson here. The Colosseum could stabilize emperors when they used it to distribute favor and embody discipline. It could destabilize them when they mistook public fascination for political wisdom. Commodus may have felt adored or awe-inspiring in the arena. To many elites, he appeared grotesque. The same space that had reinforced dynastic legitimacy under the Flavians became, in his hands, a mirror of imperial narcissism. And yet we should be careful not to let senatorial disgust tell the whole story. The crowd may have reacted differently. Some spectators almost certainly enjoyed the emperor's physical performances. Spectacle rewards extremity. An emperor who seemed larger than life, fearless, and dramatically present might excite the people even while alarming the aristocracy. The gap between elite literary judgment and popular response is one of the great interpretive problems of Roman history. Still, Commodus's case illuminates the political danger built into the amphitheater. The Colosseum was a device for dramatizing power, but drama can escape control. Once rulership becomes spectacle, the ruler must constantly compete with his own performance. Moderation looks weak. Escalation becomes tempting. Theater eats government. In the end, Commodus was assassinated. His memory was attacked. His performances in the arena became part of the case against him. Later generations remembered him less as benefactor than as warning. This too is part of the Colosseum's history. It could magnify emperors. It could also expose them. The Colosseum survives not only as stone, but as story. And stories simplify. Over centuries, a handful of images have come to dominate public imagination: the gladiator saluting the emperor with a fixed phrase, the crowd turning thumbs down to condemn a defeated man, every fight ending in death, Christians dying there by the thousands, the audience as absolute sovereign over mercy and slaughter. These images are powerful because they are clear. Unfortunately, history is not obliged to be clear. Let us take the myths one by one. The salute. Popular culture loves the line, "Those who are about to die salute you." It appears in films, novels, and television as though every gladiator in every amphitheater formally delivered it before combat. In fact, the famous phrase appears in a much more limited ancient context, associated with combatants in a staged naval spectacle under Claudius, not as a standard formula of ordinary gladiatorial life. That does not mean fighters never addressed the emperor ceremonially. But the iconic line is not the universal gladiatorial greeting later imagination made it. The thumbs-down verdict. This is perhaps the most persistent image of all. A defeated gladiator kneels. The crowd roars. The emperor looks outward. Thumbs go down. Death follows. The trouble is that the evidence for specific thumb gestures is maddeningly ambiguous. Ancient texts refer to hand signals and crowd responses, but they do not give us the neat modern code of thumbs down equals death, thumbs up equals mercy. Some scholars have argued the exact opposite, that an extended or turned thumb may have signified the drawn sword and death, while a concealed thumb symbolized mercy. The point is not that we now know the real sign with certainty. The point is that certainty is precisely what we do not have. Much of the modern image owes more to later artistic conventions, especially 19th-century painting, than to unambiguous Roman evidence. Did every fight end in death? No. This is one of the easiest myths to reject and one of the hardest to kill. Gladiators were expensive to acquire and train. Skilled fighters were valuable assets and public attractions. While death was always possible and sometimes absolutely intended, many bouts ended with one fighter defeated but spared. Referees, rules, and financial considerations all shaped outcomes. Roman spectacle was brutal, but it was not economically irrational at every turn. This does not mean mercy was common in the moral sense we might wish. It means the institution balanced danger with preservation. The audience wanted intensity. It did not necessarily require constant loss of expensive professionals to feel satisfied. Did the crowd decide everything? Not exactly. The crowd mattered. Its reactions could be loud, insistent, and politically meaningful. Spectators could plead, cheer, boo, and create strong pressure around a decision. But final judgment in a gladiatorial context rested with the sponsor of the games, the editor, and in major imperial events that meant the emperor or his authority. The crowd participated in the emotional economy of mercy and death. It did not govern independently. That distinction matters because it restores political structure to what later legend often imagines as pure mob rule. Roman spectacle loved the appearance of communal judgment, but within a hierarchy. Was the arena only bloodlust? Again, no. Blood was central, but so were status, ritual, discipline, novelty, imperial generosity, legal punishment, and moral interpretation. Spectators could admire skill, laugh at theatrical absurdity, pity a noble death, marvel at exotic animals, resent a stingy sponsor, or use the games to socialize and be seen. The amphitheater condensed many public functions into one place. Calling it mere bloodlust is too simple. Calling it anything innocent would be dishonest. The point is that Roman spectacle had cultural density. Were Christians massacred there by the thousands? This is the most emotionally charged myth of all, and it requires special treatment, which we will give in the next chapter. For now, it is enough to say that persecution of Christians in the Roman Empire was real, and executions in arenas certainly happened in some times and places, but the specific notion that the Colosseum was above all a giant slaughterhouse of Christians is far shakier than popular memory suggests. Why do these myths endure? Because they offer symbols more than history. Thumbs down gives us a perfect image of arbitrary death. The universal salute gives us theatrical fatalism. Constant death makes Roman cruelty simple and total. Christian mass martyrdom turns the building into a moral monument rather than a civic machine. Each myth isolates one aspect of truth and inflates it until complexity disappears. But complexity is where the real fascination lives. The crowd did matter, yet did not rule. Death was frequent, yet not automatic. Gesture mattered, yet its exact forms are obscure. Mercy existed, yet under power. The arena was cruel, yet not meaningless. To reject the myths is not to soften Rome. It is to see Rome more clearly. And when we do that, the Colosseum becomes even more unsettling. Not because it was a simple slaughterhouse of legend, but because it was a highly organized institution capable of making violence seem rational, beautiful, entertaining, and politically useful all at once. That is harder to dismiss than myth. Because it is closer to history. Few subjects attached to the Colosseum arouse stronger feeling than the question of Christian martyrdom. For centuries, the building has been imagined as sacred ground soaked with the blood of persecuted believers. Crosses were placed there. Devotions developed around it. Later Christian memory turned the ruin into a site of witness and suffering. Even today, many visitors arrive expecting the Colosseum to be primarily a martyr monument. The historical problem is that memory and evidence do not align neatly. Let us begin with what is true. Christians were persecuted at various moments in the Roman Empire, though not continuously and not always with the same intensity. Some were executed publicly. Some were condemned to beasts or other arena deaths. Roman authorities certainly used spectacular punishment against people they considered dangerous, obstinate, or socially disruptive. There is no reason in principle why Christians could not have died in or around the Colosseum. The difficulty arises when we ask for specific, secure evidence tying famous martyrdoms directly to this building. That evidence is thinner than popular tradition suggests. The earliest Christian sources often describe martyrdoms in broad terms or name general settings without giving the kind of precise architectural identification later generations desired. Rome had multiple venues for execution and spectacle. The Colosseum, while central and famous, was not the only possible site for public punishment. Over time, as the memory of persecution became more stylized and the building itself more monumental in Christian imagination, traditions clustered around it. This is understandable. The Colosseum was visually overwhelming, morally charged, and increasingly available as a symbol after pagan spectacle faded. It made sense for later Christians to see it as the monumental vessel of early suffering. But symbolic suitability is not the same as documentary proof. Take the oft-repeated claim that thousands of Christians were martyred in the Colosseum. No secure ancient evidence supports such a specific mass total for this building. Numbers like these belong more to devotional imagination than to critically recoverable history. Persecution itself was episodic, locally variable, and often driven by specific political or administrative circumstances. The Roman state did not run a constant industrial slaughter of Christians in the amphitheater. None of this should be used to diminish real martyrdom or real suffering. On the contrary, careful history honors the dead more seriously than legend does. If Christians were executed in Rome's public spectacles, and some certainly were somewhere within that penal world, their witness does not need inflation to matter. What changed the meaning of the Colosseum was the Christianization of the empire. As Christianity moved from persecuted minority to favored religion and eventually imperial orthodoxy, buildings once tied to pagan or civic spectacle had to be reinterpreted. The Colosseum, with its associations of blood and empire, offered fertile ground for moral reversal. A place once used to stage state violence could become a monument to those who had suffered under that state. The logic is powerful and emotionally satisfying. By the medieval and early modern periods, this Christianized reading deepened. The Colosseum became associated with penitence, devotion, and sanctified memory. Crosses and stations were installed. Popes connected the site with martyr remembrance, sometimes more explicitly than the ancient evidence warranted. The ruins' aura changed. What had once symbolized imperial magnificence and public entertainment became, in Christian moral imagination, a warning against cruelty and a witness to faith. This transformation is historically important even if some of its factual claims are uncertain. Because meanings are part of history too. The Colosseum's Christian afterlife tells us how later societies needed to use Rome. They did not merely preserve the amphitheater as antique stone. They baptized it into a new story. In that story, power yielded to conscience. Persecution yielded to sanctity. Blood once shed for entertainment or punishment became blood remembered as testimony. Scholars today therefore tread a difficult path. They must resist unsupported certainties while acknowledging the legitimacy of later memory as a historical force in its own right. The question is not simply, were Christians killed there, but also, how and why did the Colosseum come to stand for Christian martyrdom so powerfully? The answer lies in the building's emotional adaptability. Its stones were always ready to be recruited into new moral worlds. For pagan Rome, the Colosseum had dramatized order through violence. For later Christians, it dramatized faith surviving violence. Both readings used the same ruin. And that is one of the reasons the building has never ceased speaking. But eventually the world that made Roman spectacle possible began to change. The crowds did not vanish overnight. The arena did not simply fall silent in one dramatic moment. Instead came a long, uneven transformation in which economics, religion, politics, and time slowly altered what the Colosseum could be. The stone remained. The meaning began to shift. The empire that had filled it with blood was itself beginning to tire. Great institutions rarely end with the clarity of their beginnings. The Colosseum did not close one final night with a ceremonial silence and a crowd that knew it had seen the last games. Its decline was slower, uneven, and bound up with the transformations that remade the Roman world between the 3rd and 6th centuries. Several pressures converged. First came political instability. The 3rd century was an age of crisis for the empire: military upheaval, rapid imperial turnover, inflation, external invasions, internal revolt. In such an environment, the resources required for lavish spectacles became harder to marshal consistently. Emperors still needed public display, but the rhythms of state finance and state confidence were altered. Second came economic strain. The empire did not become poor overnight, but its fiscal machinery grew more stressed. Maintaining vast public entertainments in the old style demanded a surplus of wealth, transport, administrative capacity, and symbolic confidence. As these became harder to sustain, the scale and frequency of spectacles changed. Third came cultural transformation. Christianity's rise did not instantly abolish arena entertainments, but it altered the moral climate in which they were justified. Christian thinkers often condemned spectacles as cruel, idolatrous, morally corrupting, or spiritually dangerous. Some converts were urged to avoid them entirely. The very habits of collective feeling that earlier emperors had exploited now came under new scrutiny. This did not mean all Christians rejected all public shows in the same way, nor did it mean the populace suddenly lost its taste for spectacle. Roman habits had deep roots. But a building once central to imperial self-definition was entering a world in which its old meanings no longer commanded unanimous confidence. Animal hunts continued for a long time. So did some forms of arena display. Gladiatorial combat, however, seems gradually to have diminished and eventually disappeared earlier than the hunts. The exact chronology is debated in detail, but by the 5th century the classic gladiatorial system was effectively gone. Several factors likely contributed: changing moral criticism, altered military and fiscal priorities, reduced supply structures, and the simple fact that institutions requiring expensive training schools and complex social acceptance can decay once elite commitment weakens. The old justifications no longer had the same force. The arena could still punish. It could still astonish. But the world that had made the gladiator a central figure of Roman public life was passing away. Then there were the shocks of history itself. Rome in late antiquity was no longer the unquestioned political center it had once been. Emperors increasingly ruled elsewhere. Court life moved. Administrative gravity shifted. The city remained symbolically immense, but it was not what it had been under the early empire. A venue built to dramatize the capital's centrality could not remain untouched by the decentering of that capital. Environmental and structural damage also mattered. Fires and earthquakes repeatedly struck the city over centuries. The Colosseum suffered such blows and required repairs. Some emperors undertook restorations, which tells us that the building remained important long after its opening glory. Yet each restoration occurred in a changed world. Repair itself was evidence of endurance, but also of vulnerability. By late antiquity, the amphitheater was already becoming layered with memory. Spectacles still occurred, but the building was no longer only a present tense machine. It was also an inheritance from another age, still active, but old enough to be looked at historically by those who used it. This historical self-consciousness is one of the signs of real transformation. Institutions decline not only when they stop functioning, but when they begin to feel inherited rather than natural. Christian emperors did not simply march into Rome and shut everything down in a single moral gesture. Reality was slower and less pure than that. Yet over time the combination of changing values, changing finances, and changing political structures wore away the old arena culture. The Colosseum persisted, but the civilization that had once filled it effortlessly with professional death was loosening its grip. By the 6th century, major spectacles had ceased. What remained was the building. And the building, stripped of its original purpose, entered a new phase that many monuments know but few as dramatically as this one: reuse. A monument abandoned is never simply empty. It becomes opportunity. When the games faded, the Colosseum did not vanish into silence and untouched ruin. It entered the practical imagination of the Middle Ages. To later viewers, medieval reuse can look like vandalism. Stones pried loose. Marble burned for lime. Arches blocked up. Walls incorporated into fortifications. But to people living among ancient remains, such acts were often not sacrilege. They were pragmatism. Ancient Rome left behind a city full of materials, spaces, and monumental shells. Medieval Romans inherited not a museum, but a quarrying ground, a habitation zone, a sacred landscape, and a political resource. The Colosseum's vast shell invited adaptation. At various times, parts of it were used for housing, workshops, storage, and defensive occupation. Powerful Roman families in the Middle Ages, especially the Frangipani, incorporated the ruin into fortified networks. This too has its own logic. An enormous stone structure with commanding walls and strategic location is difficult to ignore in a city of factional conflict. The amphitheater that once organized spectators could now organize defense. Earthquakes accelerated the transformation. Major seismic events in 847 and 1231 damaged the structure severely, contributing to the collapse of large sections of the outer ring on the south side. What modern visitors often experience as romantically picturesque asymmetry is in part the result of catastrophe. The broken profile of the Colosseum is not only the work of time or treasure seekers. It is also the work of sudden violence from the earth itself. Once collapse occurs, reuse intensifies. Fallen stone becomes easier to appropriate. Standing sections become more precarious. The line between monument and material bank grows thinner. Marble revetments, seating surfaces, and decorative features were stripped over time. Iron clamps holding blocks together were removed, leaving the familiar pockmarks visible today. Stone was hauled off for other buildings. Lime burners turned marble into mortar. Churches, palaces, roads, and civic structures throughout Rome incorporated matter once belonging to the amphitheater. In a sense, the Colosseum dispersed into the city. This does not mean medieval Romans had no reverence for antiquity. Reverence and reuse can coexist. Ancient ruins inspired awe, legends, superstitions, and moral reflection. But reverence rarely prevented extraction when material needs were pressing and legal protection uncertain. The Christian reinterpretation of the building deepened in this period as well. The Colosseum's association with martyrdom, uncertain in ancient evidence, grew in force through devotional imagination. A ruin soaked in memories of pagan bloodshed could be morally reclaimed through penitence and sacred association. The building's very brokenness helped this new identity. Ruin invites meditation. A functioning arena is noisy with purpose. A shattered one asks what that purpose was worth. Travelers and writers in the Middle Ages and Renaissance often projected stories onto the building. Giants, demons, martyrs, emperors, pagan cruelty, divine punishment, such themes clustered around it because the ruin seemed too enormous to be mute. It demanded narrative. There is something strangely fitting in this. The Colosseum had always been a machine for story. In the Middle Ages, deprived of its original performances, it became the subject of stories instead. Its medieval life also reminds us that preservation is a luxury of certain historical conditions. When states are weak, property rights fragmented, and urban resources scarce, ruins are rarely preserved for posterity in the modern sense. They are lived in, exploited, defended, feared, and repurposed. The Colosseum survived not because everyone agreed to protect it, but because even after immense damage it remained too massive to disappear completely. That mass is part of the secret of its survival. Smaller ancient structures vanished more thoroughly. The Colosseum was simply too much building. It could be wounded, mined, inhabited, and stripped, yet still remain unmistakably itself. By the early modern period, however, a new relationship to antiquity was emerging. Artists, scholars, popes, antiquarians, architects, and travelers began to look at ruins not just as sources of material or pious legend, but as historical evidence and aesthetic objects. The Colosseum would once again change meaning. From quarry, it would become document. From fortification, image. From broken utility, monument. The Renaissance did not discover the Colosseum, of course. It had never been lost. But Renaissance and early modern Europe discovered a new way of seeing it. Humanists and antiquarians approached ancient Rome with fresh hunger for textual, architectural, and historical understanding. Artists came to study proportion, mass, decay, and the emotional charge of ruins. Travelers on the Grand Tour later treated the city as a required education in antiquity. The Colosseum, because of its scale and symbolic complexity, became one of the chief objects of this new gaze. It was no longer merely useful or devotional. It was sublime. Painters and engravers found in it a perfect subject: broken grandeur, the victory of time over empire, vegetation softening stone, moonlight through arches, tiny modern figures dwarfed by ancient mass. The Colosseum became a visual shorthand for the romance of ruin. To depict it was to say something about mortality, civilization, and the persistence of the past. Antiquarians, meanwhile, measured, sketched, compared, and argued. They wanted to know how the building had functioned, what its original form had been, how ancient sources corresponded to visible remains. Their methods were often imperfect by modern standards, but they laid foundations for later archaeology. The ruin became not just beautiful, but legible. This shift had practical consequences. Once a monument is seen as historical evidence and aesthetic treasure, the case for protecting it strengthens. Popes issued measures against stone theft or uncontrolled destruction at various points, though enforcement varied. Conservation in the modern sense remained far away, but attitudes were changing. By the 18th and 19th centuries, the Colosseum had become a central station in Europe's moral and artistic imagination. Romantic writers saw in it the ruin of imperial pride. Christian visitors saw sanctified suffering. Architects studied its engineering. Tourists described their emotional responses in diaries and letters. Moonlit visits became a kind of cultural ritual. The building's afterlife expanded far beyond Rome. Archaeology gradually transformed understanding further. Excavation of the arena floor and underground spaces revealed more of the hypogeum and the building's internal logic. Scholars corrected older assumptions, debated phases of construction, and compared the Colosseum to other amphitheaters. The ruin ceased to be just a picturesque shell. It became a technical and historical puzzle to be solved. Modern restoration efforts, especially from the 19th century onward, also shaped what visitors now see. Brick buttresses were added to stabilize damaged sections. Dangerous collapses were prevented. Debris was cleared. Later interventions, some elegant, some intrusive, became part of the building's biography. Preservation is never neutral, it leaves its own fingerprints. The Colosseum we visit today is not the raw ruin of the Middle Ages, nor the complete amphitheater of Titus, but a layered object shaped by ancient use, medieval adaptation, early modern reverence, archaeological exposure, and modern conservation choices. The 20th century added yet another layer: nationalism. Modern states love ancient monuments because monuments compress legitimacy into stone. In Italy, and especially under fascism, ancient Rome became a potent reservoir of political symbolism. Mussolini's regime appropriated Roman imagery relentlessly, using imperial grandeur to dignify modern authoritarian ambition. The Colosseum, along with forums, arches, and imperial avenues, formed part of a visual language of power. This appropriation mattered because it showed how easily the building could be recruited into new ideologies. The Colosseum did not belong only to antiquity. It could be made to speak for modern empires too. Yet the same 20th century also deepened scholarly and popular understanding of the building as a site of complex human history rather than simple patriotic inheritance. Conservation science improved. Archaeological methods became more rigorous. Interpretive frameworks widened beyond imperial triumph to include labor, violence, class, religion, and memory. Tourism transformed the experience yet again. Millions now pass through the arches each year. Queues replace processions. Audio guides replace heralds. Security barriers replace arena railings. The modern visitor encounters the Colosseum as protected heritage, educational destination, and global icon all at once. This is its own form of spectacle, not blood, but attention. And attention has consequences. A monument visited by millions must be managed, repaired, explained, and marketed. The Colosseum's modern life depends on conservation funding, scholarship, visitor infrastructure, and international symbolic capital. It remains expensive. The economics have changed, but wonder still has a price. One of the most striking developments in recent decades is the way the Colosseum has been mobilized as a moral symbol against capital punishment. Illuminations and public gestures have linked the ancient arena, once a place of state-sponsored death spectacle, to contemporary campaigns for life and mercy. This is an extraordinary reversal. A building that once normalized public killing has become, for many, a platform from which to condemn it. History does not often offer such clean inversions. But when it does, they reveal the plasticity of monuments. The Colosseum has always been more than one thing. Imperial gift. Machine of death. Christian memory site. Quarry. Fortress. Romantic ruin. National symbol. Archaeological archive. Tourist destination. Moral warning. Each age has chosen which Colosseum it needs. And ours is no exception. Today the Colosseum belongs simultaneously to Rome, to Italy, to scholarship, to tourism, and to the global imagination. Very few ancient buildings have achieved this kind of symbolic saturation. Even people who know little about Roman history recognize its silhouette. It appears in films, logos, textbooks, advertisements, documentaries, political rhetoric, and digital culture. It has become a universal image for antiquity itself, so universal, in fact, that it risks becoming abstract. But the building resists abstraction if we stand before it long enough. Modern tourism reshapes the experience dramatically. Visitors arrive with cameras, tickets, timed entry slots, security checks, and expectations formed by school lessons and media. They move through a managed heritage environment designed to protect the monument while making it legible to mass audiences. Signs explain, railings restrict, guides narrate, and the ruin becomes a carefully curated encounter with the past. Some lament this as overmanaged. Yet without such management, the building could not survive contemporary attention. Millions of feet, changing weather, pollution, vibration, and time continue to threaten it. Conservation is now part of the monument's daily life in the same way hidden maintenance once was during the Empire. There is a strange continuity in that. The Colosseum has always needed unseen work. What has changed is the purpose. Once the work served spectacle. Now it serves memory. The building's global status also means it is constantly translated into contemporary ethical language. For many, it stands as shorthand for the cruelty of empire and the seductions of public violence. For others, it is a triumph of engineering and civic planning. For still others, it is sacred memory or simply a beautiful ruin. These readings do not cancel one another. They coexist uneasily, just as the building's own past contains contradictory meanings layered in stone. The anti-death penalty symbolism attached to the Colosseum in recent years is especially revealing. Illumination campaigns and public ceremonies have used the monument as a stage for advocating the abolition of judicial execution worldwide. This is not antiquarian nostalgia. It is the modern mobilization of historical memory for present ethical action. The message is deliberate: a place once famous for making death public should now stand for the rejection of state killing. Whether every visitor knows this symbolism hardly matters. The fact that the monument can carry it at all tells us how radically its meaning has changed. And yet, for all the reinterpretations, the building still confronts us with the inescapable fact of its origin. The Colosseum was built to gather a stratified society under imperial authority and make organized violence meaningful. No later sanctification, romanticization, or political repurposing can erase that. To admire its engineering without acknowledging its function would be shallow. To condemn its cruelty without acknowledging its brilliance would also be shallow. The task is to hold both. This is what mature historical attention requires. Not comfort. Not easy denunciation. Not empty admiration. But steadiness in the face of contradiction. The Colosseum is beautiful. It is horrifying. It is intelligent. It is cruel. It is a civic achievement. It is an imperial wound. It is dead stone. It is still alive with interpretation. That is why it continues to draw us. We sense, perhaps, that the building understands something permanent about organized society, that power loves ceremony, that crowds love meaning, that violence becomes easiest to accept when wrapped in architecture, status, and story. Rome gave those instincts an extraordinary physical form. We visit because we want to know how such a form could exist. And perhaps because we suspect that we are not as distant from it as we would like to believe. The Colosseum's afterlife in modern culture is therefore not a decorative footnote. It is the final stage of the documentary. The building is still performing. It still gathers crowds. It still organizes movement. It still produces awe. Only now the spectacle is our attention itself. We stand where others once cheered. We photograph where others once judged. We read plaques where others read the body. We condemn the cruelty, admire the structure, and then carry the image home. In that sense, the Colosseum remains what it always was. A machine for concentrating human feeling. The feelings have changed. The machine has not. The Colosseum did not become legendary because of one opening alone. After Titus and Domitian, generations of emperors learned to use the amphitheater as a political instrument, each in his own style. Some treated it as a place to renew civic bonds. Some used it to advertise conquest. Some repaired it after damage and thereby claimed continuity with the great rulers of the past. Some, like Commodus, turned it into a theater of self-display so intense that later memory could not forgive it. This long imperial life matters because it reminds us that the Colosseum was not a frozen Flavian artifact. It remained active, adaptive, and politically useful for centuries. Trajan, for example, looms large in later memory as one of Rome's most successful rulers, and ancient sources associate his reign with spectacular games on an immense scale. After his Dacian victories, triumph and spectacle intertwined in familiar Roman fashion. The empire's external success had to be translated into urban experience. Whether every number reported for Trajanic spectacles is trustworthy is less important than the pattern. Conquest furnished both wealth and occasion, and the Colosseum helped turn military achievement into public feeling. Hadrian's relationship to the building seems less flamboyant, but his wider reign shows how important continuity could be. An emperor did not always need to reinvent the amphitheater. Sometimes it was enough to maintain the institution, to keep the civic machine functioning, to allow the city's expectations to continue being met. Stability itself could be performative. Antonine rulers inherited this logic. The Colosseum had become part of what empire did. Public generosity was now institutionalized. To neglect major entertainments was to risk appearing detached from Rome's body politic. To provide them was to step into a script already written by predecessors. Then there were the emperors of restoration. Fire damaged the Colosseum in the 3rd century, and inscriptions preserve evidence of rebuilding under later rulers, including Decius and perhaps Gordian III, with additional work by still later emperors. These repairs remind us that every generation met not the pristine amphitheater of Titus's opening but a building already aging under pressure. Restoration had practical necessity, but it also carried political symbolism. The emperor who repaired the Colosseum placed himself inside its memory, becoming not originator perhaps, but caretaker of Rome's most famous theater of civic identity. Even in eras of strain, the building remained worth repairing. That fact alone tells us how much symbolic weight it carried. There is also the issue of frequency versus magnificence. Not every day at the Colosseum was a once-in-a-century extravaganza. Many events were more routine, and routine is historically important. Institutions become central not only through the extraordinary but through repetition. Children grew up expecting games. Citizens learned to think of imperial generosity in terms shaped by recurring spectacle. The amphitheater formed habits of emotion as much through the regular as through the sensational. Yet the sensational mattered too. Certain emperors understood the value of scale in particular moments of transition or anxiety. A new ruler, a military triumph, a public celebration, a dynastic anniversary, a restored peace after crisis, these demanded special magnificence. The Colosseum was uniquely suited to such occasions because it could gather the city, dramatize abundance, and allow imperial presence to become emotionally immediate. We should not imagine all emperors mastering this equally well. Some likely appeared more comfortable in the role than others. A ruler's personality mattered. His tolerance for noise, crowd unpredictability, and prolonged public visibility mattered. His willingness to be seen judging life and death mattered. Some emperors may have endured the amphitheater as obligation. Others embraced it as opportunity. A few seem to have needed it as confirmation. This spectrum reveals something broader about Roman monarchy. The emperor was always both institution and person. The Colosseum pressed both dimensions at once. It required the institutional role of provider, but it also exposed the individual man performing that role to scrutiny. That scrutiny could be subtle. Did he arrive punctually? Did he sit through the unpleasant parts or withdraw? Did he appear moved by courage? Did he indulge excess? Did he seem bored by the people or eager for their praise? Such impressions, impossible to quantify, mattered in a political culture where formal channels of public opinion were limited. Spectacle became one of the places where ruler and ruled tested one another. And across all these reigns, the amphitheater accumulated imperial ghosts. Titus opening it with overwhelming abundance. Domitian deepening it with hidden mechanisms. Trajan magnifying victory through scale. Commodus desecrating dignity through narcissistic performance. Later restorers claiming continuity in times of fracture. The building became a dynastic archive in stone, each ruler leaving not only repairs or spectacles behind, but associations. When later generations looked at the Colosseum, they did not see only one emperor. They saw layers of rulership, each attached to a different use of public violence and generosity. That layered imperial history helps explain why the building became so adaptable in memory. It had never belonged to one moment alone. It belonged to repeated acts of political theater. And repeated theater leaves deep marks. The Colosseum concentrated attention on the instant of spectacle. But what happened afterward? When the crowd went home, when the victor received applause, when the condemned lay still, when the sand had to be turned and replaced, what became of the bodies through which Roman meaning had just been staged? This question matters because spectacle tends to erase aftermath. The arena trained attention on climax, the charge, the blow, the decision, the reveal. Yet every institution of public violence depends on systems that manage what comes next. Start with the gladiators. A wounded gladiator who survived did not simply limp away into legend. He entered a practical world of treatment, recovery, and evaluation. Roman medical care could be more competent than modern stereotypes assume, particularly where valuable bodies were concerned. Gladiatorial schools had strong incentives to preserve trained fighters whenever possible. Wounds had to be cleaned, bound, and monitored. Broken bones set if they could be. Diet adjusted. Rest enforced. Trainers judged whether a man could return to combat, required retraining, or had become too damaged to remain useful. This medical afterlife is an important corrective to the myth of gladiators as endlessly disposable. Some certainly died. Others accumulated scars over years, each one part of a body that was both weapon and property. A successful fighter's survival had commercial and symbolic value. Each return to the arena deepened his reputation. The dead, however, required another form of management. Corpses had to be removed quickly so the spectacle could continue. Ancient references suggest designated exits and practical procedures for carrying away the dead or incapacitated. Attendants entered the arena between acts not just to rake sand, but to restore the visible stage to legibility. Blood had to be covered. Bodies had to disappear. The machine of attention could not remain fixed too long on aftermath without changing the emotional register of the day. For gladiators, burial and commemoration varied. Some left epitaphs paid for by comrades, spouses, lovers, patrons, or burial clubs. These inscriptions are among the most humanizing pieces of evidence we possess. They preserve names, ages, records of victories, places of origin, and the grief or pride of those who remembered. A fighter whose life in the arena was structured by public type and costume might, in death, return to a more personal identity. Here a wife names him. Here a fellow gladiator honors him. Here a trainer records skill and loss. Such epitaphs tell us that the gladiatorial world had its own social bonds. Men who fought under coercion or contract still made friendships, rivalries, affections, and households. The arena commodified them, but it did not erase their capacity for relation. The condemned likely received far less care in memory. Many of them died precisely because the state had stripped them of protected status. Their bodies may have been disposed of with little ceremony, unless relatives, religious communities, or burial associations intervened. This asymmetry is instructive. Rome did not value all dead equally. The prestigious body, the useful body, the remembered body, and the shameful body passed through different posthumous fates. Animals too had an afterlife in the arena economy. Carcasses might be removed, butchered in some cases, discarded in others, or used in ways that leave little trace in the literary record. The practical question remained the same: how does one clear spectacles remains efficiently enough to prepare the next event? There is something morally revealing in this efficiency. The Colosseum could not function if it lingered too long over consequence. It needed turnover. Its logic required that death be both visible and absorbable. What mattered was not only that the crowd see bodies broken, but that the building itself prove capable of incorporating such breakage without interruption. That capacity, making death manageable, is one of the deepest continuities between the spectacle world and the building's later symbolic afterlife. The Colosseum always stood at the intersection of violence and administration. Memory complicates this administrative logic. The state may have wanted a condemned body to disappear into warning. A victorious gladiator might want his fame to endure. A lover or family member might want grief to outlast the noise. A Christian community might later want martyrdom remembered as witness rather than punishment. In every case, the same event generated competing afterlives. This is why the arena never fully controlled meaning. It controlled staging, access, timing, and sequence. It did not control what later generations would do with memory. Even in antiquity, memory could resist the terms of spectacle. A fighter intended as expendable might become beloved. A condemned person intended as warning might be admired. An emperor intending to buy approval might instead leave a reputation for vulgarity. The Colosseum was powerful, but it never perfectly mastered interpretation. That gap between event and memory is where history lives. And it is also why the building can still move us. We know, now, more than the crowd was meant to know. We know about the rope crews, the medical care, the burial inscriptions, the legal categories, the ecological cost, the ideological purpose. We see the aftermath that spectacle wanted us to pass over. To stand in the Colosseum today is therefore to occupy an unusual position. We are viewers of a theater designed to structure viewing, but we are no longer trapped inside its original rhythm. We can pause where the ancient audience had to move on. We can ask what happened to the body once it left the sand. And once we ask that, the building becomes even larger than before. Not because its arches grow, but because its human consequences do. Ancient Rome built many amphitheaters. They stood in provincial cities across the empire, from Gaul to North Africa, from Spain to the eastern Mediterranean. Some survive magnificently. Verona's arena still hosts performance. The amphitheater at El Jem in Tunisia still dominates its landscape. Pompeii preserves an earlier stone example than the Colosseum itself. Many others remain as partial ruins, archaeological traces, or transformed urban spaces. So why did this one dominate memory? Part of the answer is obvious. It stood in Rome. The capital city was always more than one city among others. It was the symbolic center of empire, the place where political imagination converged. A monument there had advantages no provincial structure could match. It was described by authors, seen by embassies, remembered by rulers, and later visited by pilgrims, artists, antiquarians, and tourists. Centrality magnified survival. Scale mattered too. The Colosseum was enormous even by Roman standards. It compelled notice. When later ages encountered it in ruin, they did not need specialist knowledge to feel its force. Sheer magnitude can carry memory across centuries even when function has been forgotten. But there is a deeper reason. The Colosseum condensed contradictions better than almost any building on Earth. It was technically brilliant and morally disturbing. It was public and hierarchical. It was generous and coercive. It was urban and imperial. It was beautiful and brutal. Such contradictions make monuments durable in imagination because they allow successive ages to select different meanings without exhausting the object. A purely functional building may become obsolete. A monument full of unresolved tension remains available for reinterpretation. The Colosseum could therefore be made to mean glory, cruelty, sanctity, ruin, nation, warning, and world heritage without ever ceasing to be recognizably itself. Its form was strong enough to survive semantic change. There is also the matter of visibility. The broken outer wall, the exposed inner arcades, the underground revealed where the arena floor no longer survives, these features make the building readable even to non-specialists. A visitor can intuit structure. One sees where crowds sat, where arches carried weight, where hidden spaces lay below. The ruin educates the eye. That educational readability is unusual. Many ancient monuments require imagination before they become legible. The Colosseum, even in damage, explains itself. Not fully, not without help, but enough to provoke curiosity. It is an argument in architecture that almost anyone can begin to follow. Finally, the building endured because people never stopped needing it. Emperors needed it for legitimacy. Medieval families needed it for defense and stone. Christians needed it for sanctified memory. Artists needed it for the sublime. Nationalists needed it for prestige. Scholars needed it for evidence. Tourists need it for contact with antiquity. Modern moral culture needs it as warning and symbol. This continuous usefulness did not preserve the building intact. On the contrary, different needs often damaged it. But usefulness kept it in circulation. It was never forgotten long enough to vanish. In that sense, the Colosseum is not merely a surviving monument. It is a victorious one. Not victorious because Rome's values triumphed forever. They did not. Many were repudiated. Some were sanctified into opposites. Rather, the building triumphed because it kept forcing itself into human thought. It remained too large to ignore, too charged to neutralize, too adaptable to discard. That is the empire of memory. And in that empire, the Colosseum is still sovereign. Now let us return to Rome. Not the Rome of emperors and processions, but the Rome of evening when the heat loosens at last and the city exhales. The crowds thin. Light withdraws from the upper arches. The stone cools slowly after the day's sun. Shadows gather where senators once sat and where sailors once handled the ropes of the awning. Beyond the walls, scooters pass and distant voices rise from restaurants and streets. But inside the ruin, another silence begins. Stand there long enough and the Colosseum becomes difficult to reduce to any one meaning. It is not just a ruin. It is an argument between centuries. The Flavians wanted it to proclaim restored order after civil war. The crowd wanted it to thrill, reassure, frighten, and delight. Gladiators entered it as a workplace of terror and fame. Condemned prisoners entered it as a terminal sentence. Animals entered it from worlds they could not understand. Christian memory later entered it and found witness there. Medieval families found stone, shelter, and fortification. Antiquarians found evidence. Romantics found sublime decay. Dictators found prestige. Tourists find symbolism. Campaigners against execution find warning. All of them are right, and none of them are enough. Because the Colosseum is larger than the uses to which it has been put. It is a machine that outlived the civilization that perfected it. A monument built to make power feel natural. A theater in which hierarchy became architecture. A witness that remembers not by speaking, but by enduring. Look again at the broken outer wall. The missing marble. The scars where iron clamps were ripped free. The exposed underground chambers like a body opened after death. Nothing here is pristine. Nothing here flatters simple admiration. The building shows its wounds too openly for that. And perhaps that is why it matters so much now. If the Colosseum had survived intact, it might be easier to mistake it for pure grandeur. Ruin makes honesty harder to avoid. The fractures reveal process. The missing surfaces reveal appetite. The underground reveals labor. Damage reveals time. What survives is not just the monument Rome intended, but the record of everything that happened to it after intention failed. The Colosseum teaches no single lesson, but it asks severe questions. What kinds of violence does a society normalize when it can frame them as entertainment, justice, or necessity? What labor disappears behind public magnificence? How does architecture teach people where they belong? How often does power present domination as generosity? And how easily do later generations inherit beauty without wanting to reckon with the suffering that made it possible? These are not Roman questions only. That is why the building remains alive. Not because it still hosts games. Not because its myths are simple. But because it confronts each generation with itself. By day it is crowded with explanation. By night it returns to stone. And stone is patient. The emperors are gone. The crowds are gone. The beasts are gone. The sand no longer hides fresh blood. But the form remains, and with it the unsettling proof that human beings once gathered here by the tens of thousands to watch the state turn death into meaning. And then, centuries later, other human beings gathered to remember, reinterpret, mourn, admire, warn, and wonder. That is what makes the Colosseum more than a relic. It is a hinge between worlds. A place where empire became architecture, architecture became memory, and memory became moral argument. So when you leave it, when you step back into the modern streets of Rome and the ordinary noise of the living city, do not leave with only the familiar images of gladiators and roaring crowds. Leave also with the hidden things. The quarrymen at Tivoli. The captives bent under loads. The rope crews below the floor. The women high in the upper tiers. The frightened animal in the dark cage. The condemned man hearing the crowd before he saw the light. The emperor learning whether generosity had bought affection. The medieval builder prying loose a stone. The pilgrim praying before a cross. The archaeologist measuring a corridor. The conservator stabilizing a crack. The visitor standing still at dusk, trying to understand how one building can hold so much of what humans are capable of. That is the final secret of the Colosseum. It was never only about death. It was about what a civilization chose to honor, conceal, consume, and remember. And in the broken arches, under the Roman sky, that choice is still visible. The stone remembers. And now, so do we.